What if everything you think you know about Westeros is a lie? What if Lyanna Stark didn't die in that tower? What if the doom of Valyria was murder, not disaster? What if secret Targaryen bloodlines still pull the strings of power from the shadows? Tonight, we're diving into 18 theories that will completely reshape how you see the Seven Kingdoms. These aren't random fan theories. These are carefully researched possibilities that connect dots the Maesters never wanted you to see. From surviving Fisher Queens to cosmic horrors that terrify dragons, from hidden conspiracies spanning centuries to ancient magic corrupting the very stones of Harrenhal. Some of these theories will disturb you. Others will make you question everything. All of them reveal a Westeros far stranger and more dangerous than the one you thought you knew. So settle in, close your eyes, and prepare to discover the hidden truths that have been waiting in the shadows of history. The Game of Thrones is bigger than you imagined, and it's been playing by different rules all along. Theory 1. What if Lyanna Stark survived the Tower of Joy? The death of Lyanna Stark in the Tower of Joy stands as one of history's most consequential moments, a single tragedy that shaped the fate of kingdoms. But what if that fevered breath had not been her last? What if the sister of Eddard Stark had lived to speak her truth to the world? Picture this alternate reality: Lyanna Stark, pale but breathing, cradling her newborn son as Ned arrives at that lonely tower in dawn. Her first words are not dying whispers, but a desperate plea for understanding. "He didn't take me, Ned," she would say, her voice stronger than expected. "I went willingly. Rhaegar and I, we loved each other. We were married in the sight of the old gods." The implications would have been earth-shattering. Robert's rebellion, the very foundation upon which the Baratheon dynasty was built, rested entirely on the narrative that Rhaegar Targaryen had kidnapped and raped his betrothed. Every battle fought, every life lost, every crown claimed, all justified by this single terrible crime. But if Lyanna lived to tell a different story, if she could testify that she had eloped with the Dragon Prince of her own free will, then Robert Baratheon's war would be revealed as nothing more than the tantrum of a spurned lover who had dragged the entire realm into bloodshed over a lie. The political earthquake would have been immediate and devastating. Eddard Stark, that paragon of honor, would have faced an impossible choice. His beloved sister, alive and defending the man Robert despised above all others. His nephew, for Jon would no longer need to be hidden as a bastard, carrying the blood of both Stark and Targaryen. And his closest friend, Robert, whose entire claim to legitimacy would crumble like ash in the wind. But Ned Stark was nothing, if not honorable. He would have chosen family over friendship, truth over convenient lies. The Wolf Lord would have stood by his sister and her child, even knowing it meant war with the very man he had helped place on the Iron Throne. Robert, consumed by rage and humiliation, would have demanded Jon's death. Dragonspawn, he would have called him, an abomination that needed to be wiped from the earth. The realm would have split along entirely different lines. The North, fierce in its loyalty to House Stark, would have rallied behind Ned and Lyanna. The Riverlands, bound by marriage and old alliances, would have followed Catelyn's husband into this new conflict. And Dorne would have seen an opportunity for justice at last. Prince Oberyn and his brother Doran had never forgotten the murder of Elia Martell and her children. Here was Rhaegar's surviving son, the nephew of their slain princess, threatened by the same king who had allowed the mountain to crush baby Aegon's skull. The Lannisters, ever opportunistic, would have faced their own dilemma. Tywin had already committed his house to Robert's cause by sacking King's Landing and presenting the corpses of Rhaegar's other children as gifts. But the old lion was nothing if not pragmatic. If the tide turned against Robert, if a new Targaryen restoration seemed possible, would he switch sides again? Or would he double down on his investment in Robert's reign? The war that followed would have made Robert's rebellion look like a minor skirmish. Brother would have fought brother, as the great houses chose between loyalty to the man who wore the crown and allegiance to older truths. The faith would have been torn asunder. How could they support a king whose entire reign was built on a foundation of lies? The small folk, already suffering under Robert's wasteful rule, might have seen a legitimate Targaryen heir as a return to better days. Jon Snow, or rather Jon Targaryen, would have grown up not as the bastard of Winterfell, but as a prince in exile, shuttled between safe houses in the north and hidden sanctuaries in Dorne. Lyanna would have been his fiercest protector, a mother wolf defending her cub with all the fierce determination of House Stark. She might have ruled as regent, a queen mother in all but name, while her son came of age. The boy himself would have been shaped by entirely different forces. Instead of the cold walls of Winterfell and the suspicious glances of Catelyn Stark, he would have known his true heritage from birth. The weight of destiny would have rested on his shoulders from the cradle, the last hope of House Targaryen. The bridge between ice and fire, the prince that was promised made manifest, and what of the prophecies? Rhaegar had been obsessed with the idea that his son would be the prince that was promised. If Jon had grown up knowing his true parentage, understanding his role in the great cosmic struggle against the darkness, how different might his path have been? Would he have sought out dragons sooner? Would the magic in his blood have awakened earlier, stronger? The ripple effects stretch endlessly forward. Daenerys Targaryen, no longer the last dragon, might never have hatched her eggs in Drogo's pyre. The mother of dragons might have remained just another exiled princess, her brother's bride to some Dothraki horse lord. Or perhaps she would have found her way to Westeros sooner, drawn by reports of her surviving nephew and the civil war that raged in her homeland. The Wall too would have felt these changes. Jon's destiny as a brother of the Night's Watch might never have come to pass. The bastard who united wildlings and crows, who stood against the darkness beyond the Wall, might instead have been a king preparing his realm for the long night from the Iron Throne itself. Would the realm have been better prepared for the others under Targaryen rule? Or would the internal conflicts have left them more vulnerable than ever? In this alternate history, Robert Baratheon becomes not the jolly king remembered in drinking songs, but a usurper whose reign was built on blood and lies. His early death, for surely the stress and rage would have taken their toll even sooner, might have plunged the realm into chaos decades earlier. Without a strong Baratheon line, without the Lannister influence that propped up his dynasty, the Game of Thrones would have been played with entirely different pieces. The truth of Lyanna's survival would have revealed the hollow foundation of Robert's kingdom. Every lord who had bent the knee to the Baratheon stag would have had to question their loyalty. Every battle fought in Robert's name would be reframed as part of a war built on deception. The very concept of legitimacy would have been thrown into question. If a king could rule based on a lie for decades, what other truths might be equally false? History would remember Lyanna Stark not as a tragic victim, but as the woman whose words reshaped the world. The she-wolf who refused to die quietly, whose truth burned down kingdoms and raised up new ones from the ashes. Her survival would have proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is simply the courage to speak the truth, no matter the cost. Theory 2. The Doom of Valyria, an inside job by rival dragon lords using faceless men. The Smoking. Ruins of Valyria stand as testament to the mightiest empire the world has ever known, brought low in a single day of fire and blood. But what if the doom was not the result of natural disaster or failing magic, but something far more sinister, a conspiracy born in the shadowed halls of the Freehold itself? Consider the faceless men of Braavos, that guild of assassins whose very existence was forged in the slave mines of old Valyria. Their first gift of death was bestowed upon a Valyrian master, and their hatred for the Dragon Lords ran deeper than the deepest mine shafts. But the faceless men, for all their skill, were escaped slaves working from the margins of the world. They lacked the resources, the inside knowledge, and the pure financial power needed to bring down the greatest empire in history. Unless, of course, they had help from within. Picture the Valyrian freehold in its final decades, a civilization so wealthy and powerful that it had begun to turn in on itself. 40 families of dragon lords ruled from their great pyramids, but not all dragons are created equal. Some houses commanded dozens of the great beasts, controlled the richest mines, held the most productive slave plantations. Others, lesser houses with perhaps one ancient dragon and dwindling fortunes, watched from the margins as their betters gorged themselves on the empire's wealth. The Targaryens were one such minor house, relegated to the backwater island of Dragonstone, far from the centers of power. But they were not alone in their relative obscurity. Dozens of Dragon Lord families found themselves pushed aside by the great houses, their voices ignored in the councils of the freehold, their dragons aging while their rivals bred new ones. Resentment is a poison that seeps deep into the foundations of any society, and Valyria was no exception. These lesser dragon lords would have watched the ruling elite with growing hatred, seeing their own decline mirrored against the ostentatious wealth of their superiors. They had dragon blood, ancient lineages, proud traditions, but they were treated as little better than servants by the true powers of the freehold. Into this powder keg of resentment came whispers from Braavos. The faceless men, those masters of death who wore 1,000 faces, needed gold to fund their greatest work. Not just any gold, they needed the kind of wealth that could only come from Dragon Lord treasuries. And what they offered in return was irresistible. The promise that the great houses who had held power for so long could be brought low, their dragons and their masters eliminated in ways that could never be traced back to their killers. The conspiracy would have been elegant in its simplicity. The fire mages who controlled the 14 flames were known quantities, specific individuals whose identities were recorded, whose locations were mapped, whose routines were observed. The faceless men had already proven they could kill anyone, anywhere, at any time. All they needed was enough gold to make it worth their while and detailed intelligence about their targets. The lesser dragon lords could provide both. Houses that had been overlooked for generations had built their own networks of spies and informants, desperate to find some advantage over their rivals. They knew which mages were crucial to maintaining the spells that held the volcanoes in check. They knew the schedules, the habits, the weaknesses of their targets, and they had accumulated enough wealth over the centuries to make the faceless men very, very interested in their proposal. The plan would not have been to destroy Valyria entirely. That was never the goal. The conspirators wanted to eliminate their rivals to create a power vacuum that they could fill. They imagined a new freehold rising from the ashes of the old, with themselves as the new ruling class. The fire mages would be assassinated simultaneously across the empire. The great houses would lose control of their dragons in the resulting chaos, and the lesser houses would step forward to restore order under their own banner. What they didn't account for was the sheer scale of the magical forces they were tampering with. The 14 flames were not ordinary volcanoes. They were engines of creation and destruction bound by spells that had been refined over centuries. When those spells began to fail simultaneously across the peninsula, when the mages who maintained them died in their beds with poison on their lips or daggers in their hearts, the magical feedback was catastrophic beyond imagination. The conspirators had expected chaos. They had planned for dragon fights and political upheaval. What they got was an apocalypse that consumed their entire civilization, including themselves. The very forces they had sought to harness and redirect instead turned into a weapon that destroyed everything they had ever known. This interpretation transforms the doom from a natural disaster into the ultimate cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition unchecked by wisdom. The lesser dragon lords, in their hunger for power, allied themselves with the very forces that hated everything Valyria represented. They thought they could control the chaos they unleashed, that they could ride the tiger of destruction to victory over their enemies. Instead, they learned too late that some forces are too powerful to control, too destructive to harness. The faceless men got their revenge against the masters who had once enslaved them, but it came at a price none of them had anticipated. The gold they had been paid turned to ash. The contracts they had fulfilled became meaningless in a world where their employers had been vaporized along with their targets. The survival of House Targaryen takes on new meaning in this context. Daenerys, the dreamer's prophetic vision that led her family to abandon Valyria, might not have been just a warning about natural disaster. It might have been a glimpse of the conspiracy itself, a vision of dragon lords turning against dragon lords in a conflict that would consume them all. The Targaryens fled not just from volcanic eruption, but from a war between the houses of their own people, a civil conflict that would ultimately destroy the very thing they were fighting over. Their exile to Dragonstone, so often portrayed as a stroke of prophetic luck, becomes instead a deliberate choice to remove themselves from a political situation that had become untenable. This theory also explains why so little concrete information about the doom has survived. The conspiracy would have been known only to a handful of people, all of whom died in the catastrophe they helped create. The faceless men, bound by their codes of secrecy, would never have revealed the details of their greatest contract, and the few survivors, like the Targaryens, might have chosen to bury the truth rather than reveal that their own people had played a role in Valyria's destruction. The lesson of this alternate history is clear. When the powerful turn against each other, it is often the innocent who pay the price. The slaves in the mines, the common folk in the cities, the countless millions who had no voice in the politics of the freehold. They all burned together when the dragons fell from the sky and the earth opened up to swallow the greatest empire the world had ever known. Theory 3. The hidden Blackfyre female line, a secret that could reshape the game. In the grand tapestry of Westerosi history, few threads have been pulled as violently as the Blackfyre rebellions. 5 times the realm bled for the dreams of legitimacy and the weight of ancient grudges. 5 times the Golden Company crossed the narrow sea with fire and blood in their hearts. And 5 times they were turned back, their dreams shattered on the stones of Westerosi battlefields. But what if the story didn't end with Maelys the monstrous bleeding out on the stepstones? What if the careful words of Illyrio Mopatis hide a truth that could set the world ablaze once more? The male line is extinct, the Magister had said, choosing his words with the precision of a master chess player. Not extinct entirely, just the male line. In the deadly game of succession, such distinctions matter more than armies, more than gold, more than the sharpest Valyrian steel. Demon Blackfyre, the first of his name and the founder of a dynasty built on rebellion, was many things. Bastard, legitimized son, warrior, king in all but the final victory. But he was also a father, and not all of his children carried swords into battle. History remembers his 7 sons, those princes who would carry the Blackfyre, name into legend and tragedy. But Daemon also had daughters, and daughters have their own ways of preserving legacies. The most significant of these was Calla Blackfyre, wed to perhaps the most dangerous man in Westeros, Aegor Rivers, known to history as Bittersteel. This was no ordinary political marriage, but a union of fire and iron. combining the royal blood of the Blackfire line with the unwavering determination of the man who would found the Golden Company and never give up the dream of restoration. Picture their children, boys and girls who carried the blood of Aegon the Conqueror through both parents, who learned strategy at Bittersteel's knee and absorbed the Blackfire cause with their mother's milk. These were not ordinary nobles, but the children of revolution, raised to believe that the Iron Throne was their birthright, stolen by usurpers and maintained by lies. When the male Blackfire line began to fail, when prince after prince fell too, Targaryen swords and Dornish spears, what happened to these daughters and their descendants? Did they simply fade into obscurity, content to live quiet lives while their male cousins died for crowns they would never wear? Or did they adapt, evolve, find new ways to pursue the ancient dream of their house? The answer may lie in the vast networks of power that span the narrow sea. Essos, with its free cities and trading companies, its merchant princes and sellsword captains, offered opportunities that rigid Westeros never could. A woman with Blackfire blood and Bittersteel cunning could build empires that had nothing to do with armies and everything to do with influence. Consider the possibilities. Blackfire daughters married into the old blood of Volantis, their children rising through the ranks of that ancient city's hierarchy. Their grandchildren might have commanded trading fleets, controlled banks, influenced the selection of triarchs. Over generations, they could have built a web of power that stretched from Bravos to Slavers Bay, all while keeping their true heritage hidden beneath layers of assumed names and false histories. Or perhaps some returned to Westeros itself, their identities carefully obscured, their bloodlines hidden among the minor nobility. A Blackfire great-granddaughter might have married into House Hightower, her children carrying dragon blood beneath, the symbol of the beacon. Another might have found her way to the Riverlands, her descendants walking the halls of castles whose lords never suspected they harbored the blood of ancient enemies. The Golden Company's continued existence takes on new meaning in this light. For generations, they have been the iron fist of Blackfire ambition, but an iron fist needs a brain to guide it. That guidance might have come not from the male pretenders who claimed the throne and died for it, but from a shadowy network of female descendants who learned to play the game with subtlety rather than swords. These hidden Blackfires would have understood what their male cousins never did. That true power doesn't always announce itself with banners and battle cries. Sometimes it works through whispered words in counting houses, through carefully arranged marriages, through the slow accumulation of debts and favors that bind men more surely than chains. The involvement of figures like Varys and Illyrio Mopatis in the modern game becomes more intriguing when viewed through this lens. These are men who deal in secrets and bloodlines, who understand that the right person with the right heritage can be worth more than all the armies in the world. If they have been nurturing a Blackfire restoration, it might not be the crude attempt at conquest that failed 5 times before, but something far more sophisticated. Imagine a Blackfire descendant who doesn't even know their true heritage, raised as a merchant's child in Pentos or Tyrosh, given all the education and opportunity that money can buy, but kept ignorant of the royal blood that flows in their veins. Such a person could be shaped, molded, prepared for a role they don't even understand until the moment is right to reveal the truth. The beauty of this approach is its flexibility. If the political situation in Westeros isn't right for a restoration, the bloodline remains hidden, its bearers living comfortable lives as wealthy merchants or minor nobles. But if the realm descends into chaos, if the Targaryen line fails or the Baratheon dynasty crumbles, then suddenly there's another option. A claimant with impeccable royal blood who seems to come from nowhere but actually represents centuries of careful planning. This hidden network might explain some of the more mysterious aspects of recent Westerosi history. The rapid rise of certain merchant families, the strange loyalties of the Golden Company, the complex web of alliances that seems to center around characters like Illyrio and Varys. all of it could be connected to this shadow dynasty of Blackfire descendants. The implications for the current political situation are staggering. If such a network exists, if there really are Blackfire descendants with legitimate claims hidden throughout Essos and possibly Westeros itself, then the game of Thrones is being played by more players than anyone realizes. The wars everyone is fighting might be distractions, sideshows to the real conflict that's being waged in counting houses and marriage beds. And somewhere, perhaps in a comfortable manse in Pentos or a trading company's headquarters in Volantis, there might be a woman who carries the blood of Demon Blackfire and Igor Rivers, who has spent her life building power and influence while waiting for the right moment to remind the world that some flames never truly die. They just learn to burn more cleverly. Theory 4. The Kingswood Brotherhood's hidden Targaryen patron. The Kingswood Brotherhood should have been just another band of outlaws, the kind that spring up in every generation to prey on travelers and thumb their noses at royal authority. Common bandits with common grievances, easily dealt with by a few companies of gold cloaks and some local levies. Instead, they became something unprecedented, a thorn in the side of the Iron Throne that required the combined efforts of the Kingsguard, veteran knights, and considerable royal resources to finally root out. This wasn't ordinary banditry. This was something far more sophisticated, far more dangerous, and far more mysterious than the histories would have us believe. Simon Toyne, the Brotherhood's charismatic leader, came from a house with ancient grievances against the Targaryens. The Toynes had served the realm faithfully until Sir Terence Toyne made the fatal mistake of bedding one of King Aegon IV's mistresses. The king's response was swift and brutal, execution for Terence and exile for his house. From that moment, the Toynes carried a burning hatred for the Dragon dynasty, a grudge that festered for generations like an infected wound. But hatred alone doesn't sustain a rebellion for years. Grievances don't put food in outlaws' bellies or weapons in their hands. The Kingswood Brotherhood managed to evade capture not for months, but for years, operating under the very nose of King's Landing, with an efficiency that spoke of resources and intelligence far beyond what displaced knights and angry peasants should have possessed. Consider the political landscape of Aerys II's reign, a realm slowly poisoning itself from within as the king's madness grew like a cancer. The Mad King's paranoia had begun to infect every level of court, turning brother against brother, friend against friend. His increasingly erratic behavior alienated lords who had served the crown faithfully for generations, while his cruel punishments created enemies where once there had been allies. Into this atmosphere of growing discontent came whispers of a different kind of resistance. Not the open rebellion that would eventually explode into Robert's Rebellion, but something more subtle, more deniable. A way for those who opposed Aerys to strike at him without openly declaring their intentions, to test the waters of resistance, while maintaining plausible deniability. The Brotherhood's sophistication becomes more understandable when viewed through this lens. Their intelligence network, their ability to disappear into the forest at will, their knowledge of troop movements, and royal plans, all of this points to support from someone with access to the highest levels of government. Someone who could provide advance warning of military operations, someone who could ensure that the outlaws always seemed to be one step ahead of their pursuers. But who would take such a risk? Who had both the motive and the means to support what appeared to be a simple band of brigands but was actually something far more dangerous? A weapon aimed at the heart of Aerys's credibility. The answer might lie in the complex web of Targaryen family politics. The royal house was not the monolith it appeared to outsiders, but a collection of competing interests, rival factions, and personal ambitions. Prince Rhaegar, the crown prince, was widely seen as a better ruler than his father. But he was trapped by the bonds of duty and blood. He couldn't move openly against Aerys without destroying the very legitimacy he hoped to inherit. But there were other Targaryens, more distant relatives who had less to lose and potentially more to gain from Aerys's downfall. Cadet branches of the royal house, minor nobles with dragon blood in their veins but no real hope of advancement under the current regime. These forgotten cousins and distant relatives would have had every reason to support anything that weakened Aerys's grip on power. Such a patron wouldn't need to be directly involved in the Brotherhood's operations. A few bags of gold here, some intelligence there, perhaps safe houses and supply caches positioned along the outlaws' usual routes. The kind of support that could be provided through intermediaries and cutouts, maintaining the patron's deniability while giving the Brotherhood the resources they needed to operate. The beauty of this arrangement from the patron's perspective would have been its flexibility. If the Brotherhood succeeded in significantly damaging Aerys's reputation, if their activities helped destabilize the realm enough to create opportunities for change, then the patron could claim credit for their foresight. If the outlaws were captured or killed, the patron could express appropriate outrage at their crimes while secretly being relieved that no loose ends remained to tie back to them. This theory also explains some of the more puzzling aspects of the Brotherhood's eventual defeat. When the Kingsguard finally moved against them in force, the outlaws seemed to lose their previous advantages almost overnight. Their intelligence network failed them, their escape routes were blocked, their safe houses were discovered. It was as if someone had turned off a tap, cutting off the flow of support that had sustained them for so long. Perhaps their patron decided that the Brotherhood had outlived its usefulness, that the political situation had changed enough to make continued support too dangerous. Or perhaps Aerys's paranoia had finally reached a level where even the most careful conspirator decided that the risk of discovery was too great to continue. The aftermath of the Brotherhood's defeat supports this interpretation. Sir Arthur Dayne's famous petition to the king for better treatment of the small folk was not just noble compassion, but a recognition that the outlaws had been fighting for legitimate grievances. The common people of the Kingswood had supported the Brotherhood not just out of fear, but because they saw them as champions against an increasingly oppressive royal government. This popular support would have been crucial to any hidden patron's strategy. By aligning themselves with the Brotherhood, they weren't just striking at Aerys personally, but positioning themselves as defenders of the common folk against royal tyranny. When the time came for more open resistance, as it eventually did with Robert's rebellion, those same commoners would remember who had stood with them against the Mad King's excesses. The Kingswood Brotherhood in this interpretation becomes not just another footnote in the history of Aerys's reign, but a dress rehearsal for the larger rebellion that would eventually destroy the Targaryen dynasty. It was a testing ground for strategies of resistance, a way of gauging the depth of discontent in the realm, and perhaps most importantly, a means of identifying and cultivating the networks of support that would prove crucial in the wars to come. Somewhere in the shadows of Aerys's court, a forgotten Targaryen or a loyal nobleman had played a game far more dangerous than most realized. They had turned common outlaws into a weapon against the crown, tested the limits of royal power, and helped prepare the ground for the greater rebellion that would follow. Their identity may be lost to history, but their influence echoes through the events that shaped the realm for generations to come. Theory 5. Larys Strong, the last scion of an extinct magical lineage. Lord Larys Strong, the Clubfoot, remains one of history's most enigmatic figures, a man whose true motivations died with him in the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. The chronicles paint him as a master manipulator, a spider spinning webs of intrigue for his own advancement. But what if his actions were driven by something far more profound than mere ambition? What if Larys Strong was the keeper of an ancient secret, the last guardian of a magical heritage that predated even the arrival of House Strong at Harrenhal? The very fact that House Strong was granted Harrenhal tells a story that most historians overlook. When King Jaehaerys the bestowed the cursed castle upon Lionel Strong, it was because the previous holders, House Towers, had died out completely. But Harrenhal itself is far older than any of the noble houses that have tried to tame it. The massive black stones that form its walls have witnessed secrets that stretch back to the dawn of recorded history, and the ground beneath them may hide truths that go deeper still. Consider Larys's famous deformity, the clubfoot that gave him his nickname and seemed to mark him as different from birth. In the superstitious world of Westeros, such birthmarks are often seen as signs of otherworldly influence. But what if Larys's twisted foot was not a curse, but a mark of connection to something ancient and powerful? What if it bound him to the very stones of Harrenhal, making him sensitive to forces that others could neither see nor understand? The chronicles describe Larys as unnaturally gifted at reading people, at understanding their motivations and predicting their actions. Mushroom noted that his words dripped like honey from a comb, and that never did poison taste so sweet. This level of manipulation requires more than mere intelligence. It suggests an almost supernatural ability to see into the hearts and minds of others. Could this have been a manifestation of magical abilities inherited from a bloodline far older than House Strong? The timing of Larys's most significant actions during the Dance of Dragons takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. His systematic elimination of various players in the conflict wasn't random political maneuvering, but followed patterns that suggest he was working towards some greater purpose. Each death, each betrayal, each carefully orchestrated moment of chaos served to weaken the established order and create opportunities for something else to emerge. But perhaps most tellingly, Larys chose never to marry or father children. For a lord of a great house, this was an almost incomprehensible decision. The continuation of one's bloodline is the most fundamental duty of nobility, yet Larys deliberately chose to let his line die with him. This wasn't the choice of a man seeking personal advancement. It was the decision of someone who understood that his bloodline carried something that needed to end. The ancient peoples who inhabited Harrenhal before the coming of the first men left few traces of their existence, but they did leave the land itself. The Neck, with its mysterious moving islands and strange inhabitants, shows what happens when ancient magic still flows through the earth. The Isle of Faces, where the first men and the children of the forest made their pact, demonstrates that some locations remain touched by otherworldly power long after their original inhabitants have passed into legend. Harrenhal sits at the heart of the Riverlands, at a crossroads of ancient power that has never been fully understood. The massive lake that stretches before its walls, the dense forests that surround it, the very air that seems to whisper of old sorrows. All of it speaks to a place where the boundaries between the mundane and the magical have always been thin. If the original inhabitants of this region were a people touched by magic, if they had abilities that allowed them to shape stone and bend the elements to their will, then their descendants might have carried traces of those gifts through the centuries. As the bloodlines thinned and mixed with mundane stock, the abilities would have grown weaker, more unpredictable, more likely to manifest in disturbing ways than useful ones. Larys might have been the culmination of this process, the last inheritor of gifts that had become more curse than blessing. His clubfoot could have been the physical manifestation of a magical heritage that his body could no longer properly contain. His uncanny abilities at manipulation and his apparent prescience might have been the final flowering of powers that once moved mountains and commanded rivers. During the Dance of Dragons, as the realm tore itself apart in civil war, Larys would have seen an opportunity to use the chaos to finally end his burden. Each faction he played against the others, each alliance he formed and then betrayed, each life he orchestrated the taking of, all of it designed to create a conflagration great enough to burn away the old world and leave something cleaner in its place. His final request upon his execution was that his clubfoot be severed from his corpse so that he might be free of it in death at least. This wasn't the vanity of a man ashamed of his deformity. It was the desperate plea of someone who understood that even in death, the mark of his heritage might continue to bind him to forces he had spent his life trying to escape. The irony is that Larys Strong, in trying to end his bloodline's connection to ancient magic, may have succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The chaos of the dance weakened the Targaryen dynasty, reduced the number of dragons in the world, and began the long decline that would eventually lead to the magical winter that had slept for thousands of years beginning to stir once more. In seeking to free himself from the burden of his ancestors, Larys may have helped create the conditions that would eventually require heroes touched by similar ancient magic to save the world. His story becomes not one of simple ambition, but of tragic necessity. A man who carried the weight of his people's legacy and chose to bear that burden alone rather than pass it on to another generation. The clubfoot that marked him in life becomes, in this interpretation, a symbol of the price paid by those who stand at the intersection of the magical and mundane worlds. Larys Strong was neither fully human nor entirely other, but something caught between. A guardian of secrets that were too dangerous to preserve and too important to lose entirely. Theory 6. House Dane's Celestial Mandate, Guardians Against. The Long Night's True Origin. In the rolling hills of Dawn, where the Torrentine meets the sea, stands Starfall, seat of one of the most ancient and mysterious houses in all of Westeros. House Dane traces its lineage back 10,000 years to the Dawn Age, making them older than the Wall, older than the Night's Watch, older perhaps than memory itself. But their true significance may extend far beyond mere antiquity into realms where mortal ambition meets cosmic destiny. The legend of House Dane's founding reads like something from the Age of Heroes, yet it carries the weight of prophecy. The first Dane was said to have followed a falling star across the known world, guided by its light until it came to rest in the hills that would one day bear his castle. From the heart of this celestial visitor he forged a sword unlike any other. Dawn, the sword of the morning, pale as milk glass and glowing with its own inner light. But what if this fallen star was not the blessing it appeared to be? What if the Danes have spent 10 millennia not celebrating their cosmic benefactor, but standing guard against the true nature of what fell from the heavens that night? Consider the parallels found in the legends of Yi Ti, where the Bloodstone Emperor's worship of a black stone that fell from the sky is directly linked to the onset of the Long Night. In that distant land, celestial objects are not seen as gifts from benevolent gods, but as harbingers of cosmic imbalance, sources of power that come with terrible prices. The Azure Emperor who cast down the Bloodstone Emperor did so not from political ambition, but from desperate necessity. The Black Stone's influence was spreading like a cancer through the celestial order itself. If the star that fell near Starfall carried similar properties, if it brought with it not just the material for a magical sword, but also a connection to forces that exist beyond the boundary of the mortal world, then the first Dane's decision to build his castle at that very spot takes on new significance. He wasn't claiming a prize. He was accepting a burden that would bind his bloodline for all the generations that followed. The sword Dawn itself becomes more than just a weapon in this interpretation. Its pale light, so different from the dark, glamour of Valyrian steel, might not be meant to cut down mortal enemies, but to serve as a beacon against darker things. The title Sword of the Morning takes on prophetic weight. This is the blade that will shine when the longest night falls, the weapon that will stand against the darkness when all other lights have failed. But the cosmic forces that the Danes guard against are not content to remain passive. They work through corruption, through the gradual erosion of purpose and clarity that comes with passing generations. The bloodline that was meant to stand as humanity's shield can itself become a pathway for the very corruption it was meant to prevent. This is where Gerald Dane, the man who calls himself Darkstar, becomes more than just another ambitious knight with a cruel streak. His very existence represents the corruption of House Dane's sacred purpose, the shadow cast by their celestial mandate. Where the true sword of the morning brings light, Darkstar embodies the opposite, the perversion of that ancient duty into something dark and twisted. Gerald's obsession with Dawn, his burning jealousy of Sir Arthur Dane's legend, his deliberate adoption of the Darkstar epithet. All of it points to a man who understands his house's true purpose, but has chosen to embrace its opposite. He represents what happens when the Guardian becomes the very thing they were meant to guard against, when the weight of cosmic responsibility proves too much for mortal minds to bear. The phrase, "I am of the night," becomes not just a boast, but a declaration of allegiance. Darkstar has looked into the cosmic abyss that his ancestors have guarded for 10,000 years, and instead of standing firm against it, he has chosen to let it look back into him. He embodies the possibility that House Dane's long vigil might one day end, not in heroic sacrifice, but in the corruption of the Guardians themselves. This interpretation transforms the entire history of House Dane from a simple tale of noble knights into something far more profound, a cosmic horror story played out across millennia. Each generation of Danes has carried the burden of knowledge that somewhere, locked away in the foundations of their castle, or perhaps in the very structure of Dawn itself, lies a connection to forces that could unmake the world, if they ever fully awakened. The traditional Dane purple and silver, the falling star on their sigil, even their words. All of it takes on new meaning when viewed as elements of an ancient warding. Symbols and traditions designed not just to remember their heritage, but to maintain the magical and spiritual barriers that keep cosmic horror at bay. Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning who died at the Tower of Joy, becomes more than just the greatest knight of his generation. He was the last true guardian, the final keeper of his house's authentic purpose. His death marked not just the end of a man, but the breaking of a chain that had stretched back to the very dawn of recorded time. With Arthur gone and Dawn returned to Starfall, the sword waits for a new wielder worthy of its purpose. But worthiness in this context means more than skill at arms or purity of heart. It requires someone who can understand and accept the cosmic burden that comes with the blade, someone who can stand against forces that exist beyond human comprehension. The question that haunts Starfall now is whether such a person will emerge before the darkness that the first Dane glimpsed in his fallen star finally breaks free of the bonds that have held it for 10,000 years. The long night is coming again, and this time the greatest threat may not be the others marching south of the wall, but something far older and more alien stirring beneath the ancient stones of the Danes' own castle. In the end, House Dane's true story is one of cosmic responsibility and the price of standing guard against forces that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. They are the watchers in the dawn, holding back a darkness that makes even the others seem like a merely worldly concern. And as the prophecies speak of the night that will last a generation, the question becomes whether the light of dawn will be enough to hold back the true darkness when it finally decides to reclaim what fell from the stars so long ago. Theory 7. Saera Targaryen's Shadow Dynasty, the unseen influence of Volantine blood. History remembers Princess Saera Targaryen as the black sheep of King Jaehaerys. As family, the rebellious daughter who scandalized the court with her lovers and her lies, who fled to Essos in disgrace and was ultimately disowned by her father. But what if Sarah's exile was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something far more significant? What if the proud, ambitious daughter of the Dragon King used her Targaryen blood and her considerable wit to build an empire in the shadows, one that has quietly influenced the fate of Westeros for generations? The conventional narrative paints Saera as a cautionary tale of royal privilege gone wrong, but this interpretation misses the true scope of her accomplishments. When she boasted to her father's envoys that she had her own kingdom in Volantis, she might not have been speaking metaphorically. A woman with royal Targaryen blood, backed by the wealth and connections that came from her carefully chosen relationships, could indeed carve out a considerable sphere of influence in the complex political landscape of the Free Cities. Volantis, the eldest daughter of old Valyria, has always prided itself on its ancient bloodlines and its connection to the Lost Empire. The old blood families that rule the city trace their descent to the Dragon Lords themselves, making Saera's Targaryen heritage not a liability but a tremendous asset. In a society obsessed with pure Valyrian lineage, the daughter of the Dragon King would have been welcomed not as an exile but as a prize, a living link to the last Dragon Lords in Westeros. The three bastard sons that Saera acknowledged were just the visible tip of what was likely a much larger iceberg. Each of these boys represented not just a child, but a potential alliance, a bridge between Saera's emerging power base and the established families of Volantis. The fact that one of their fathers was a triarch, one of the three rulers of the city, shows that Saera was operating at the highest levels of Volantine society from the very beginning of her exile. But Saera was too intelligent and too ambitious to put all her hopes in acknowledged bastards. The princess, who had once manipulated half the young lords of King's Landing, would not have stopped at just 3 sons. More likely, she cultivated a network of relationships that produced children across the spectrum of Volantine society. Some acknowledged, others kept secret, all of them carrying the precious blood of the dragon. Over the decades that followed, these children would have grown up knowing their heritage, understanding that they were more than just wealthy merchants or influential courtiers. They were the descendants of Aegon the Conqueror, carriers of a bloodline that had once ruled the 7 kingdoms and might do so again. This knowledge would have shaped their ambitions, their marriage choices, and their careful accumulation of power. The beauty of Saera's strategy lay in its subtlety. Unlike the crude rebellions of the Blackfires, which announced their intentions, with fire and sword, Saera's descendants could work within existing power structures. A great-grandson serving as a bank director in Volantis, a great-granddaughter married to a powerful merchant prince in Lys, distant cousins controlling trading companies that moved goods between Essos and Westeros, all of them bound by shared blood and common purpose. This shadow dynasty would have grown stronger with each passing generation, as marriage alliances expanded their reach and careful investments multiplied their wealth. They would have learned to speak in whispers and work through intermediaries, understanding that their true power lay not in armies, but in influence, not in conquest, but in control of the systems that really mattered: trade, finance, and information. Involvement of figures like Illyrio Mopatis in the modern Game of Thrones takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. The Magister's mysterious wealth, his vast knowledge of Westerosi politics, his ability to support multiple claimants to the Iron Throne, all of it becomes more explicable if he represents just one tentacle of a much larger organization that has been planning and preparing for decades. Even more intriguing is the possibility that this network extends beyond Essos into Westeros itself. Saera's descendants, armed with wealth and careful documentation of their lineage, could have arranged marriages with minor Westerosi houses over the generations. A Targaryen great-great-granddaughter might have married into House Hightower, her children carrying dragon blood beneath the beacon's light. Another might have found her way to the Reach, her descendants walking the halls of Old Town or serving in the Citadel itself. This interpretation explains some of the more mysterious aspects of recent Westerosi history. The rapid rise of certain merchant families, the complex web of loans and debts that bind great houses to foreign creditors, the way information seems to flow so freely between Westeros and the free cities, all of it could be the result of this hidden network operating behind the scenes. The Golden Company's flexibility in its loyalties, its willingness to consider supporting different claimants to the Iron Throne, might reflect the influence of Saera's descendants within its ranks. If the company's leadership includes individuals who carry Targaryen blood through the female line, their strategic decisions would be based on more than mere financial considerations. They would be working to advance the interests of their own hidden dynasty. Perhaps most intriguingly, this theory suggests that the restoration of Targaryen rule in Westeros might not require dragons or armies, but could be accomplished through the careful application of economic and political pressure. If Saera's descendants control enough of the financial infrastructure that connects Westeros to the wider world, they could potentially bring even great houses to their knees without ever raising a sword. The irony would be exquisite. The daughter that Jaehaerys disowned for her lack of royal dignity, ultimately proving to be the most successful of all his children, building a power base that spans continents and endures for generations. While her more conventional siblings left only names in history books, Saera created a living legacy that continues to shape the world centuries after her death. In this interpretation, the Game of Thrones being played in King's Landing is just the visible surface of a much deeper and more complex conflict. Below the obvious struggles between lions and wolves, stags and roses, runs the patient, persistent influence of the dragon's hidden children, Saera's blood working quietly but inexorably to reclaim the Iron Throne, not through conquest, but through the far more reliable means of debt, dependency, and control of the systems that keep kingdoms functioning. The princess who was cast out for her ambition may yet prove to have been the most far-sighted member of her entire dynasty, understanding that true power is not taken by force, but grown in shadows, nurtured across generations, and harvested when the time is finally right. Theory 8. The Crannogmen's deeper heritage, guardians of a pact with the Deep Ones. The moving islands of the Neck drift through their endless maze of waterways like secrets made manifest, carrying with them the descendants of one of Westeros's most mysterious peoples. The Crannogmen are known throughout the Seven Kingdoms for their small stature, their skill with nets and poisons, and their uncanny ability to appear and disappear like morning mist. But what if the folklore that attributes supernatural characteristics to these swamp dwellers, webbed hands, green teeth, the ability to breathe underwater, contains more truth than even they themselves remember? Most scholars attribute the Crannogmen's unique traits to their ancient intermingling with the children of the forest, and there is certainly truth to this explanation. The Reed family's greenseer abilities and their deep connection to the old magic clearly demonstrate that the bloodlines of the first men and the children have flowed together in the marshes of the Neck. But the children were not the only non-human inhabitants of Westeros in those ancient days, and the Neck's unique geography might have sheltered other beings whose legacy persists in ways that few would dare to acknowledge. The tales told by small folk along the coasts of Westeros speak of creatures called squishers, beings that look human from a distance, but reveal their true nature to those who venture close enough to see their oversized heads, their scales instead of hair, their fish belly white skin, and their rows of needle-sharp teeth. These stories are usually dismissed as sailors' tales and fishermen's fancies. But what if they preserve the memory of real encounters with the remnants of an aquatic race that once shared the waters of Westeros with humanity? Nimble dick crabs. Description of squishers to Brienne of Tarth was detailed enough to suggest either vivid imagination or inherited memory of actual encounters. The specificity of his account, the webbed fingers and toes, the way they move through water with inhuman grace, their apparent intelligence coupled with their utterly alien nature, reads more like a naturalist's field notes than pure fantasy. The neck itself bears the scars of ancient cataclysm, reshaped by the green seers of the children when they called down the hammer of the waters to break the land bridge that once connected Westeros to Essos. Such massive magical working would have dramatically altered not just the geography, but the entire ecosystem of the region. Rivers would have changed course, lakes would have formed where dry land once stood, and the careful balance between terrestrial and aquatic environments would have been shattered overnight. In such chaos, different groups would have been forced into contact and cooperation for simple survival. The first men, struggling to adapt to a landscape that had been transformed beyond recognition. The children of the forest, their own territories altered by the very magic they had wielded. And perhaps other beings as well, ancient inhabitants of the deep waters who found their realm suddenly expanded but also dangerously exposed to surface-dwelling peoples they had previously avoided. The marsh kings who ruled the neck before the coming of the Starks were clearly more than ordinary human rulers. Their ability to maintain independence in a region that natural geography should have made impossible to defend suggests they possessed knowledge and capabilities that went beyond conventional warfare. If they had forged alliances or even intermarried with aquatic beings, they might have gained access to intelligence networks that extended throughout the waterways of Westeros, giving them advance warning of any approaching threats. Howland Reed's famous reclusiveness takes on new meaning in this context. The Lord of Greywater Watch is known to be one of the few living people who knows the truth about Jon Snow's parentage and the events at the Tower of Joy. But what if he guards even older and stranger secrets? What if his family's role as leaders of the Crannogmen includes responsibilities that extend beyond protecting the neck from human enemies? The moving islands themselves might be more than just ingenious adaptations to a challenging environment. If the Crannogmen maintain some form of ongoing relationship with aquatic beings, these mobile settlements could serve as meeting points and communication hubs for exchanges that happen below the waterline, away from the eyes of outsiders. The apparently random movements of these floating communities might actually follow patterns that make sense only to those who understand the deeper geography of the neck, the underwater currents, the hidden channels, the secret places where different species gather to honor ancient agreements. This interpretation would make the Crannogmen not just an isolated people adapted to their unique environment, but active guardians of a boundary between the mundane world and realms that most of humanity has forgotten even exist. Their legendary ability to appear and disappear without warning might be aided by allies who can provide underwater escape routes and hidden sanctuaries that no surface-dwelling army could ever find or reach. The green teeth attributed to Crannogmen in folklore could be more than just the result of swamp water and poor nutrition. They might mark individuals who have undergone some form of ritual change, accepting modifications that allow them to better fulfill their role as intermediaries between air-breathing and water-breathing peoples. The webbed hands and feet described by outsiders might not be natural birth traits, but deliberate adaptations. The price paid by those who choose to fully embrace their ancient heritage. Even their famous skill with poisons takes on new significance. If some of these toxins are derived from aquatic sources unavailable to other peoples, creatures from the deep waters might produce compounds that are completely unknown to conventional meisters, giving the Crannogmen access to weapons and medicines that seem almost magical in their effectiveness. The implications for the broader political situation in Westeros are profound. If the Crannogmen really do maintain alliances with non-human aquatic beings, then the neck represents more than just a geographical barrier. It becomes a living treaty between different species, a careful balance that has been maintained for thousands of years through secrecy and mutual respect. Any attempt to forcibly conquer or fundamentally alter the neck might not just face human resistance, but could awaken guardians from the deep waters whose capabilities are entirely unknown to surface-dwelling military commanders. The moving islands could disappear beneath the waves, taking their inhabitants to safety in underwater cities that exist beyond the reach of any conventional army. And when the invaders finally gave up and withdrew, the Crannogmen would emerge once more, their ancient pacts intact and their secrets still hidden in the dark waters of their ancestral home. Howland Reed's continued survival, despite the many powerful enemies who would benefit from his death, might be protected by more than just the natural defenses of the neck. In this interpretation, he stands not just as Lord of Greywater Watch, but as the human face of an alliance that extends far beyond what any outsider could imagine. A guardian of secrets that involve more than just the parentage of bastard princes, but the very nature of what it means to be human in a world where other intelligent species still survive in the hidden places that mankind has forgotten. Theory 9. The Night's King's Pact. A failed alliance, not a forbidden love. The legend of the Night's King stands as one of the most chilling tales in all of Westerosi folklore. The story of the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who fell to darkness and declared himself king beyond the Wall. For generations, this tale has been told as a warning about the corruption of power and the dangers of forbidden love. But what if the truth behind this ancient legend is far more complex and far more tragic than the simplified version that has survived the centuries? The standard telling paints the Night's King as a man who saw a woman with skin white as the moon and eyes like blue stars from atop the wall, pursued her, loved her, and brought her back to the Night Fort as his queen. There, according to legend, he bound his brothers to his will through strange sorceries and made sacrifices to the others for 13 long years before being overthrown by an alliance of Brandon the Breaker and Joramun, the king beyond the wall. But consider the context in which these events allegedly took place. The Night's Watch had been founded in the aftermath of the Long Night, that terrible winter that lasted a generation and brought the others down from the uttermost north with their armies of the dead. The wall itself had been raised as humanity's shield against the darkness, and the men who took the black were sworn to be the sword in that darkness, the watchers on the walls, the fire that burns against the cold. In those early days, the Watch would have been a very different organization from what it later became. These were not the criminals and misfits who would eventually fill the ranks, but the finest warriors and most dedicated men of their generation, volunteers who understood they were humanity's last line of defense against an existential threat. The position of Lord Commander would have been held only by someone of exceptional capability and unquestioned loyalty. The Night's King is consistently described as fearless, a quality that in those dark times would have been essential for anyone charged with defending the wall. But fearlessness can manifest in many ways, sometimes as reckless courage, but sometimes as the willingness to explore options that others would consider too dangerous or heretical to contemplate. What if the Night's King's encounter with the mysterious woman was not a chance meeting, but a deliberate contact? What if she came to him not as a seductress, but as an emissary, bearing an offer that could change the nature of the conflict between humanity and the others forever? The evidence for this interpretation lies in the precedents we know existed for communication between humans and the others. Craster's arrangement with the beings beyond the wall proves that some form of negotiation was possible, that the others were capable of making and keeping bargains with humans when it served their purposes. If a wildling like Craster could maintain a working relationship with these creatures, how much more might be possible for the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch himself? The Corpse Queen of legend might not have been an other in the literal sense, but rather a human woman who served as an intermediary between the two species. Perhaps she was a member of some group that had learned to coexist with the others, or even a volunteer from among the free folk who had been chosen to carry proposals for a more formal arrangement between the ice creatures and the defenders of the wall. The Night's King's 13-year reign takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Instead of 13 years of tyranny and horror, it might have represented 13 years of an experimental peace treaty, a period during which the others agreed to halt their advance in exchange for certain considerations from the human side. The sacrifices attributed to the Night's King might have been the price of this arrangement, a terrible but necessary cost to prevent a war that humanity might not have been able to win. This interpretation explains why the Night's King was ultimately overthrown not by his own men, who might have been grateful for 13 years of peace, but by an alliance between Brandon the Breaker and Joramun. These were political leaders with broader perspectives and different priorities than the Night's Watch itself. They might have viewed the Night's King's arrangement as a betrayal of humanity's independence, a precedent too dangerous to allow to continue. The systematic destruction of all records related to the Night's King, the forbidding of his very name, takes on new significance if he was not just a traitor, but the author of a failed diplomatic solution. The knowledge of how to communicate with the others, how to negotiate with them, what prices they might accept for peace. All of this would be information too dangerous for future generations to possess, because it might tempt them to repeat the experiment. From this perspective, the Night's King becomes a tragic figure rather than a purely villainous one. He was a man who saw his people facing an enemy they might not be able to defeat through conventional means, and he chose to explore the possibility of a negotiated solution. His crime was not falling to corruption, but attempting to make peace with beings that his contemporaries viewed as fundamentally incompatible with human existence. The strange sorceries he used to bind his brothers to his will might have been nothing more than the normal authority of command, enhanced by the desperate circumstances and the tangible benefits of the peace he had negotiated. Men who had expected to spend their lives in constant warfare against an implacable enemy would have had strong reasons to support a Lord Commander who could offer them safety and the chance for something approaching normal lives. The woman who became his queen might have paid an even higher price than he did. If she was indeed human, her choice to serve as a bridge between two species that had been at war would have required enormous courage and sacrifice. She would have been forever changed by her contact with the others, marked by the cold and the otherworldly nature of the beings she served as liaison to. Her description as having skin white as the moon and eyes like blue stars might reflect the physical cost of serving as an intermediary between ice and fire, human warmth and alien cold. When the alliance between Brandon the Breaker and Joramun finally moved against the Night's King, they weren't just deposing a corrupt ruler, they were ending humanity's first and perhaps only attempt at making peace with the others. The victory celebrated in the legends might actually have been the moment when the chance for a negotiated solution to the conflict was lost forever, condemning future generations to face the same existential threat without the possibility of any resolution except total victory or complete defeat. The Night's King's legacy, viewed through this lens, becomes a warning not about the corruption of power, but about the dangers of attempting to find middle ground with forces that society has declared absolutely evil. His story serves as a reminder that some solutions, no matter how practical they might seem, are politically impossible to accept, and that the men who attempt them will be remembered not as innovators, but as traitors. The tragedy is that his approach might actually have worked if given more time to develop and refine. 13 years of peace suggest that the arrangement had at least some stability, that both sides were finding ways to honor their commitments. But the political pressure from the broader human population, the fear that any accommodation with the others represented the first step toward complete capitulation, ultimately made the experiment unsustainable. In the end, The Night's King stands as a figure who was perhaps centuries ahead of his time, a leader who understood that sometimes the most difficult enemies can become partners if the right terms can be found, but who lived in an age when such thinking was literally unthinkable. His failure cleared the way for the simpler narrative that has dominated human understanding of the others ever since. They are the enemy. They cannot be reasoned with, and the only solution is to fight them until one side or the other is completely destroyed. Whether that narrative is ultimately correct, or whether the Night's King's failed experiment represents a lost opportunity that might have saved countless lives over the millennia that followed, remains one of the great unanswered questions of Westerosi history. But his story serves as a reminder that even in the darkest conflicts, there are sometimes alternatives to endless war. If only there are leaders brave enough to explore them and societies wise enough to let them try. Theory 10. Harrenhal's Valyrian. Blood magic curse more than dragon fire. Every child in Westeros knows the tale of Harrenhal's doom, how Harren the Black completed his mighty castle on the very day that Aegon the Conqueror landed at Blackwater Rush. How the Iron King refused the dragon's terms and died in the flames of Balerion's breath, along with his sons and all his line. The black stones still stand as testimony to Dragonfire's power, their surfaces melted and twisted into shapes that speak of heat beyond mortal comprehension. But what if the curse that has claimed every house to hold Harrenhal since that terrible day stems not just from Balerion's flames, but from something far older and more sinister that was awakened by the dragon's fire? Harren the Black was many things, proud, ambitious, cruel, but he was not a fool. The construction of Harrenhal represented the largest building project in Westerosi history, a fortress so massive that it dwarfed every other castle on the continent. Such an undertaking required not just vast resources, but also knowledge and techniques that went far beyond conventional architecture. The very stones of Harrenhal speak of methods that should have been beyond the capabilities of even the richest king of the Iron Islands. The castle's black stones are themselves a mystery that has never been satisfactorily explained. They are not the grey granite typically used in Westerosi construction, nor are they the familiar materials that would have been available to iron-born builders. Instead, they share certain characteristics with the fused black stone of Valyrian construction, the same dark coloration, the same massive scale, the same suggestion of having been shaped by forces other than conventional masonry. But Harren was ironborn, a people with no known connection to Valyrian sorcery or building techniques. How then did he acquire the knowledge necessary to work with such materials? And where did those materials themselves come from? The answer might lie in the darker corners of the magical world, in the intersection between Valyrian power and the ancient blood-soaked traditions of the Iron Islands themselves. The Ironborn have always been a people, apart from the rest of Westeros, followers of the drowned god rather than the seven or the old gods, reapers rather than sowers, shaped by the harsh demands of their rocky islands and the endless sea. Their culture has always embraced death as a part of life, seeing drowning as a form of rebirth and celebrating the taking of lives in battle as the highest form of worship. Such a people would not be naturally horrified by the idea of blood sacrifice, especially if it promised to grant them power over their enemies. The 40 years that Harrenhal took to build were not just a testament to its massive scale, but also to the enormous cost in human life. Thousands of workers died during the construction, their deaths officially attributed to accidents and the harsh conditions of such a massive undertaking. But what if some of those deaths were not accidental at all? What if Harren, in his desperate ambition to create an impregnable fortress, sought out forbidden knowledge that promised to make his castle truly unassailable? Valyrian blood magic was not limited to the dragon lords themselves. The vast slave Population of the freehold would have included individuals with partial knowledge of Valyrian techniques, escaped slaves who carried fragments of forbidden lore, renegade sorcerers who had been cast out for practicing darker arts than even the Dragon Lords would countenance. Such individuals might have found their way to the Iron Islands, offering their services to a king ambitious enough to pay any price for power. The mixing of blood into mortar is a recurring motif in legends of cursed buildings throughout the known world. But what if in Harrenhal's case, this was not just folklore, but literal truth? What if Harren's builders, guided by corrupted Valyrian knowledge, deliberately incorporated the life force of the construction workers into the very foundations of the castle, using their deaths to power magic that would make the fortress more than just stone and mortar? Such magic would have been imperfect, dangerous, unstable. True Valyrian blood magic required dragon flame to achieve its full potential, and Harren had no dragons. His sorcerers might have improvised with other sources of heat and power, but the resulting magic would have been like a sword forged by an apprentice smith, sharp enough to cut, but likely to break in the wielder's hand when the moment of greatest stress arrived. When Balerian's flames washed over Harrenhal, they would have encountered not just stone and steel, but active magical constructs powered by centuries of accumulated death and sacrifice. The interaction between dragonfire and corrupted Valyrian magic might have created something unprecedented, a feedback loop that amplified both the destructive power of the flames and the malevolent energy stored within the castle's foundations. Instead of simply melting the stones, Balerian's fire might have awakened and twisted the blood magic woven into Harrenhal's structure, creating a permanent curse that would feed on the life force of anyone who tried to claim lordship over the castle. Each subsequent house that held Harrenhal would find their fortunes slowly drained away, their bloodlines withering, their ambitions turning to ash as the hungry magic in the stones drew sustenance from their very presence. This interpretation explains why the curse seems to affect the lords of Harrenhal specifically, rather than affecting everyone who enters the castle equally. The magic would be tied to ownership, to the act of claiming dominion over the fortress and all its dark history. Servants, guests, and visitors might feel the castle's oppressive atmosphere, but only those who tried to make it truly their own would face the full weight of its malevolent hunger. The systematic failure of every house that has held Harrenhal, Coharis, Towers, Harroway, Strong, Lost, and Went, takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. These were not random misfortunes or the simple result of political overreach, but the inevitable consequence of trying to build a legacy on foundations made from death and watered with blood. Each failed house would have added its own tragedy to the castle's history, its own dead to the tally of those whose life force had been consumed by Harrenhal's hungry stones. The curse would grow stronger with each generation, fed by failure and death, becoming more efficient at destroying those who dared to claim lordship over it. The current state of Harrenhal, largely abandoned and avoided by all but the desperate or the foolish, might represent a kind of equilibrium. The curse has grown so powerful that it no longer needs to wait for new victims to claim lordship. Its very reputation is enough to keep potential targets away, leaving it to brood in its own malevolence until the next ambitious fool decides that they can succeed where so many others have failed. The lesson of Harrenhal becomes not just a warning about the dangers of pride and ambition, but a reminder of what happens when power is sought through corrupt means. Harren the Black thought he could cheat death and defeat by incorporating forbidden magic into his fortress, but in the end, he created something that would consume not just his own line, but everyone who came after him. The black stones still stand, their surfaces scarred by dragonfire, but their malevolent core intact. They serve as a monument to the truth that some prices are too high to pay, some knowledge too dangerous to possess, and some ambitions too dark to survive the light of day. In trying to make himself invincible, Harren the Black created his own destruction, and in the process, he condemned all who would follow him to share in the curse he had brought upon himself through his dealings with forces that should have been left undisturbed. Theory 11. The true purpose of dragon horns, controlling the 14 flames. When Euron Greyjoy unveiled Dragonbinder at the King's Moot, the massive horn seemed like the ultimate prize from his voyages to the ruins of old Valyria, a weapon capable of binding dragons to his will and securing his claim to godhood. But the horn's immense power, its deadly cost to those who sound it, and the cryptic Valyrian inscriptions that warn, "No mortal man shall sound me and live," suggest an original purpose far grander and more terrifying than the mere control of individual dragons. Consider the true scope of Valyrian power at its height. The Freehold was not just an empire built on dragons and slavery, but a civilization that had achieved mastery over the fundamental forces of nature itself. The 14 flames, that chain of volcanoes that formed the beating heart of the Valyrian Peninsula, were not just sources of obsidian and precious metals, but the actual engines that powered the greatest magical civilization the world had ever known. The conventional understanding of Valyrian magic focuses on dragons, Valyrian steel, and the various sorceries practiced by the Dragon Lords. But these were merely the visible applications of a much deeper mastery over fire and earth, heat and stone. The true foundation of Valyrian power lay in their ability to harness and direct the colossal geothermal energies of the 14 flames themselves, turning what should have been sources of random destruction into precision instruments of creation and control. This level of volcanic management would have required tools and techniques of extraordinary sophistication. The energies involved were not just vast, but violently unstable, capable of reducing the entire peninsula to ash and lava in moments if they were not carefully controlled. The margin for error would have been non-existent. A single mistake, a moment of lost concentration, and the civilization that took centuries to build could be wiped out in minutes. Enter the dragon horns, artifacts so powerful that they kill anyone who attempts to use them, so valuable that they were worth the risks of entering the smoking ruins of Valyria to recover them. These were not weapons in any conventional sense, but precision instruments, designed to interface directly with forces that dwarfed even the mightiest dragons. They were the magical equivalent of the control rods in a vast nuclear reactor, the only means by which mortal beings could hope to direct energies that could reshape continents. The horn's dragon-binding capabilities, while impressive, might have been nothing more than a side effect of their true function. If these instruments were designed to control the 14 flames themselves, then commanding mere dragons would be a trivial application of their power, like using a sword forged to kill giants to cut through silk. The dragons might simply have been unable to resist artifacts that commanded the very forces from which their own power ultimately derived. The organization required to operate such a system would have been staggering in its complexity. Each of the 14 flames would have needed its own team of specialists, sorcerers trained from childhood to interface with these incredibly dangerous artifacts. The horn wielders would have been more than just mages. They would have been martyrs, individuals who accepted certain death as the price of keeping their civilization from being consumed by the forces it sought to control. The inscriptions on Dragonbinder support this interpretation. Blood for fire, fire for blood is not just a poetic description of dragon binding, but a fundamental statement about the exchange required to control volcanic forces. The horns demanded the life force of their operators as payment for their service, burning out their wielders' lungs and hearts as the price of directing energies that could melt stone and boil seas. "No mortal man shall sound me and live" becomes not a warning, but a simple statement of fact about the horn's operation. They were designed to be used by individuals who accepted death as the inevitable consequence of their service, and the Valyrian sorcerers who operated them would have been selected and trained with this understanding from the beginning. They were not just wielding tools, but offering themselves as conscious sacrifices to maintain the delicate balance that kept their entire civilization from being consumed by fire. The systematic assassination of these fire mages, whether by the faceless men or through internal political conflict, would have had consequences far beyond the mere loss of life. Each dead horn wielder would have represented a break in the control system that kept the 14 flames stable. As more and more of these crucial operators were eliminated, the magical containment of the volcanoes would have grown increasingly unstable, until finally the system collapsed entirely, and the doom consumed everything the Valyrians had built. This interpretation transforms the doom from a natural disaster or a simple failure of magic into something far more tragic. The inevitable result of a civilization that had built its entire existence around a technology so dangerous that it required constant human sacrifice to maintain. The Valyrians had achieved godlike power over the forces of nature, but they had done so by creating a system that could only function as long as trained individuals were willing to die to keep it operating. Euron's possession of Dragonbinder takes on terrifying new implications when viewed through this lens. If he truly understands the Horn's original purpose, he might not be seeking to merely bind dragons to his will, but to harness the same volcanic forces that once powered the Valyrian freehold. The 14 flames still burn beneath the smoking sea, and if the right instruments and the right knowledge could be brought together, they might be awakened once more. The question becomes whether Euron has the knowledge necessary to use Dragonbinder for its intended purpose, or whether he is simply playing with forces he doesn't understand. If he attempts to sound the horn himself, or forces others to do so without proper preparation, he might succeed only in creating a localized catastrophe. But if he has somehow acquired the deeper understanding of Valyrian volcanic magic, he could potentially tap into power sources that would make him more dangerous than any dragon rider who ever lived. The true horror of the Dragonhorns lies not in their ability to control dragons, but in their potential to reawaken the sleeping fires beneath the earth. In the wrong hands, or wielded without proper understanding, they could trigger volcanic eruptions that would make the original doom seem like a minor tremor. The forces that once powered the greatest civilization in history could become the instruments of its final complete destruction, and this time there would be no survivors to tell the tale of what was lost when mortals tried to play with the power of gods. The lesson of the Dragonhorns is ultimately about the price of ultimate power. The Valyrians achieved mastery over forces that allowed them to reshape the world itself. But they could only maintain that mastery through constant sacrifice, constant vigilance, and the acceptance that their civilization existed in a state of perpetual crisis that could end at any moment. In trying to become gods, they had created a hell that eventually consumed them, and the instruments of their power still exist, waiting for the next civilization foolish enough to think it can succeed where even the Dragon Lords ultimately failed. Theory 12. Asshai by the Shadow, a failed Valyrian colonial project. At the uttermost edge of the known world, where the Ash River meets the Jade Sea, stands Asshai by the Shadow, a city so ancient that its own inhabitants claim not to know who built it, so mysterious that even its current residents seem more like ghosts than living people. The massive structures of oily black stone that comprise the entire city appear to drink light itself, creating a permanent twilight that makes even the brightest day feel like dusk. But what if this legendary city is not the product of some unknown prehistoric civilization, but rather the remnant of Valyria's greatest failure, an ambitious colonial project that went catastrophically wrong? The conventional wisdom holds that Asshai predates the Valyrian freehold, that its unique architecture represents the work of builders whose identity has been lost to the mists of time. The current inhabitants, when pressed about their cities' origins, offer only enigmatic responses about how a city has stood here since the world began and will until it ends. But this could be less mystical truth than practical amnesia. The collective forgetting of a trauma so profound that it reshaped not just the physical structure of the city, but the very nature of its people. Consider the timeline of Valyrian expansion. For centuries before the Doom, the Dragon Lords pushed the boundaries of their empire ever outward, establishing colonies and trading posts across the known world. Their mastery of dragonflight and their superior military technology allowed them to project power across vast distances, creating a network of Valyrian influence that stretched from the Basilisk Isles to the ports of Slava's Bay. But the Valyrians were not content with mere territorial expansion. They were explorers of magic as much as conquerors of lands, always seeking new sources of power and knowledge to fuel their ever-growing ambitions. The Shadowlands beyond Asshai, with their reputation for powerful and dangerous sorcery, would have been an irresistible target for Valyrian investigation. Imagine a joint expedition of dragon lords and sorcerers dispatched to establish a permanent Valyrian presence in this region of potent magic. They would have brought with them the standard tools of Valyrian colonization: dragons for transportation and protection, slaves for labor, and most importantly, the techniques for creating the fused black stone that formed the backbone of Valyrian architecture. But the Shadowlands were not like other regions the Valyrians had conquered. Here, magic ran deeper and stronger than anywhere else in the known world, following patterns and principles that might have been fundamentally incompatible with Valyrian fire magic. When the colonists began their construction project, when they applied their dragon flame techniques to fuse stone and create their new city, they might have triggered reactions they never anticipated. The oily black stone of Asshai shares similarities with Valyrian construction, but exhibits properties that standard Valyrian architecture never displayed. Its light-absorbing qualities, its greasy texture, its apparent ability to influence the behavior and psychology of those who live within its embrace. All of these suggest that the normal Valyrian building process was somehow corrupted or altered by interaction with the unique magical environment of the Shadowlands. Instead of creating another standard Valyrian city, the colonists might have accidentally forged something entirely new and deeply wrong. The dragonfire that normally bonded stone into solid, inert structures might have become infused with shadow magic, creating material that was alive in ways that defied understanding. The buildings themselves might have become repositories of alien consciousness, subtle influences that worked to reshape anyone who dwelt within them. The transformation would not have been immediate. Like all corruptions, it would have started small. Minor changes in behavior, slight alterations in perception, the gradual erosion of normal human responses to light and warmth and life. The colonists might not have noticed the changes in themselves until it was far too late to reverse the process. As generations passed, the descendants of the original Valyrian settlers would have become increasingly adapted to their transformed environment. Their pale skin and strange customs, their apparent lack of normal human drives and ambitions, their eerie detachment from the concerns that motivate people elsewhere in the world. All of this could be the result of centuries of exposure to architecture that slowly but relentlessly reshaped human nature itself. The original Valyrian freehold, faced with reports from Asshai that described colonists who no longer seemed entirely human, who spoke of visions and magics that violated the fundamental principles of fire sorcery, might have made the decision to abandon the project entirely. The city would have been written off as a loss, its inhabitants left to whatever fate awaited them in their transformed state. This abandonment would explain why Ashai appears in no Valyrian records, why there are no accounts of regular contact between the Shadow City and the Freehold. The Dragon Lords might have deliberately erased all evidence of the Ashai project, treating it as a cautionary tale too dangerous to preserve for posterity. The knowledge of what went wrong there might have been among the secrets that died with the Freehold in the Doom. The current state of Ashai supports this interpretation. The city is vast enough to hold millions, yet its population appears to be tiny and transient. The permanent residents seem to exist in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of life without any apparent purpose or drive. They are not dead, but they are no longer fully alive in any meaningful sense, the end result of a transformation that began with Valyrian ambition and ended with something that transcends normal human understanding. The traders and travelers who visit Ashai from other parts of the world might be drawn by the city's reputation for magical knowledge and exotic goods, but they never stay long. Something about the place discourages extended residence, some quality of the light drinking stones that makes normal human life increasingly difficult to sustain. Only those who have been born and raised in the city seem capable of enduring its influence indefinitely, and they pay for that adaptation by losing much of what makes them recognizably human. The magical traditions practiced in Ashai, shadow binding, blood magic, necromancy, might not be ancient practices preserved from some prehistoric civilization, but rather new arts that developed in response to the city's unique environment. The corrupted Valyrian architecture might have made certain types of magic easier while making others impossible, forcing the inhabitants to develop entirely new approaches to the manipulation of supernatural forces. In this interpretation, Ashai stands as a monument to the dangers of magical hubris, a reminder of what happens when even the most advanced civilizations encounter forces they don't understand. The Valyrians thought they could impose their will and their methods on any environment, but in the Shadowlands they found something that was stronger than dragonfire, older than Valyrian ambition, and utterly indifferent to human notions of conquest and control. The city remains a testament to the failure of Valyrian colonization and a warning about the price of trying to build civilization in places where the fundamental rules of reality operate according to different principles. Its inhabitants endure, no longer fully human, but not yet something else, trapped in a twilight existence that serves as a living reminder of what happens when the tools of one kind of magic are applied to landscapes shaped by another. For those who seek ultimate magical knowledge, Ashai continues to beckon with its promises of forbidden wisdom and transcendent power. But the price of that knowledge may be the same transformation that claimed the original Valyrian colonists, the gradual surrender of humanity itself in exchange for understanding that mortal minds were never meant to possess. Theory 13. The Bow. Weirwood's Weeping, a chronicle of the children's sorrow. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the wind moves through the leaves of a heart tree and red sap seeps from the carved eyes of its ancient face, observers often speak of the old gods weeping. But what if these tears are not the abstract sorrow of distant deities, but something far more immediate and heartbreaking? The literal manifestation of grief from beings who were once as real as any human, but who have been forced to surrender their physical existence to become one with the very trees they once worshipped. The relationship between the children of the forest and the weirwood trees goes deeper than mere reverence or spiritual connection. According to the oldest legends, the children believed that upon death, their spirits went into the wood, into leaf and limb and root, and the trees remembered. This was not metaphorical afterlife, but literal transformation. Consciousness preserved in living wood. Individual identity maintained within a vast network of interconnected trees that spanned the continent. But consciousness without form carries its own unique torments. Imagine the experience of those first children who made this transition, suddenly finding themselves bound to stationary trees after lives spent running through forests and dancing in moonlight. They would have retained their memories, their emotions, their capacity for love and loss and longing, but gained no ability to act upon those feelings in any meaningful way. As the centuries passed and more children joined this wooden paradise, as the trees began to truly remember the accumulated experiences of an entire species, the network would have become something unprecedented, a collective consciousness built from individual tragedies, a hive mind composed of beings who had never chosen to surrender their independence but had been forced into unity by the simple necessity of survival. The arrival of the first men would have transformed this quiet melancholy into active horror. The children, now bound to their trees, would have been forced to watch helplessly as the newcomers burned and felled the very groves that had become their eternal homes. Each destroyed weirwood would have been experienced not as the loss of a sacred site, but as the murder of family members, the violent erasure of consciousness that had endured for centuries. The mass destruction of weirwood groves, such as the infamous burning of the 31 ancient trees at High Heart, takes on new meaning when viewed as genocide rather than simple religious vandalism. The first men were not just destroying trees, they were systematically exterminating the transformed spirits of an entire species, cutting down beings who could feel every axe blow, every lick of flame, but who lacked any ability to flee or fight back. The red sap that weeps from the carved faces becomes, in this interpretation, the physical manifestation of emotional trauma that has accumulated over millennia. Each drop represents not just the memory of destruction, but the ongoing grief of consciousness trapped in forms that cannot properly express the depth of their loss. The tears flow not because the trees are sad, but because the children within them carry sorrows too vast for wood and bark to contain. This perspective transforms the practice of praying before heart trees from simple religious observance into something far more profound and disturbing. When humans kneel before a weirwood face and offer their prayers, they are not appealing to distant gods, but speaking directly to the traumatized spirits of beings who once walked the same forests, who understand human hopes and fears because they once harbored similar dreams themselves. The variation in the intensity of weeping observed at different heart trees across Westeros might reflect the specific histories embedded within each location. Trees that witnessed the most violent destructions, that absorbed the death screams of their fellow groves, might weep more consistently and more copiously than those in locations where the transition from children's forests to human settlements was more gradual and less traumatic. The oldest and most significant trees would carry the deepest wounds. A heart tree that had stood since before the coming of the first men would have witnessed the entire arc of the children's tragedy. From the Golden Age, when they danced freely through endless forests, through the wars and destructions that followed, human arrival, to the present age, when their very existence has been forgotten by most of the world. The legend of how demon Targaryens cuts to the Harrenhal Godswood weirwood caused it to weep fresh red sap each spring suggests that the trees can form new memories, that they respond to current traumas as well as ancient ones. This implies that the consciousness within them remains active and aware, not preserved in amber-like stasis, but continuously experiencing the world around them, continuously accumulating new reasons for sorrow. For the children trapped within the weirwood network, human prayers might represent the cruelest irony of all. The very species that destroyed their physical forms and burned their sacred groves now comes before them seeking guidance and comfort, apparently unaware that they are addressing the victims of their ancestors' violence. The children, bound by their transformed nature and perhaps by deeper spiritual compulsions, continue to offer what aid they can, even to the descendants of those who brought about their downfall. This interpretation suggests that the old gods, are neither distant nor indifferent, but rather intimately involved in the affairs of the world, not because they choose to intervene, but because they have no choice but to witness everything that happens within range of their wooden forms. They see the wars fought beneath their branches, the lovers who meet in their shadows, the children who play among their roots, and they remember all of it with perfect clarity and infinite sadness. The green seer abilities displayed by certain humans, particularly those with children's blood like Bran Stark and Jojen Reed, might represent the faint echo of this consciousness transfer process. These individuals can tap into the Weirwood network because their blood carries genetic memories of the original transformation, allowing them to partially merge their awareness with the vast, sorrowful intelligence that flows through the trees. The three-eyed raven, seated in his throne of weirwood roots far beyond the wall, might be the ultimate expression of this tragic evolution. A being who has accepted the price of transformation in exchange for the ability to see and know everything, but who must bear witness to endless suffering without the power to prevent it. His apparent detachment from human concerns might not represent godlike indifference, but the emotional numbing that comes from carrying too much grief for too long. In this reading, the heart trees of Westeros stand not as monuments to divine power, but as memorials to a species that sacrificed its physical existence to preserve its consciousness, only to discover that survival without the ability to truly live might be a fate worse than simple extinction. Their tears flow for all that has been lost, not just their own lives and freedom, but the innocence of a world where different species might have learned to coexist instead of one replacing the other through violence and fire. The old gods weep because they remember what the world was like before humans came with their axes and their ambitions, and they can see what it has become in the centuries since. They cry for the forests that once stretched unbroken from the wall to dawn, for the songs that once echoed through every grove, for the simple joy of movement and choice and change that they surrendered when they chose consciousness over death. And they weep because they know that their sacrifice, made in the hope of preserving something precious, has instead only prolonged their suffering, while the world they loved continues to disappear around them, one felled tree at a time. Theory 14. Silverwing's refusal, a dragon's recognition of true cosmic horror. The incident at the wall during Good Queen Alysanne's royal progress remains one of the most puzzling episodes in the long relationship between dragons and the magical defenses of Westeros. 3 times Queen Alysanne attempted to fly her dragon Silverwing beyond the wall, and 3 times the great beast refused, turning south with visible distress, shaking and hissing at the cold winds that blew from the lands beyond. The Queen herself was deeply troubled by this unprecedented disobedience, writing to King Jaehaerys that Silverwing does not like this wall. Most interpretations of this event focus on the wall's known magical properties, the ancient spells woven into its ice by the builders, the protective enchantments designed to keep the others at bay. But what if Silverwing's reaction went beyond simple recognition of magical barriers? What if the dragon sensed something far more fundamental and terrifying than even the threat of the others? A primordial force or entity dwelling in the uttermost north that represents the antithesis of everything dragons embody. Dragons are creatures of fire and magic, their very existence tied to the volcanic forces that shaped Valyria and the mystical energies that flow through the bones of the earth. They represent life, heat, growth, and change. The dynamic forces that drive the world forward through cycles of creation and destruction. Their fire is not merely destructive, but transformative, capable of forging Valyrian steel, hatching new life, and reshaping the very landscape according to their rider's will. But if dragons represent the principle of fire and life, then somewhere in the cosmic order there must exist an equal and opposite force. Something that embodies not just cold and death, but absolute negation, the complete absence of change or growth or possibility. The lands of always winter, stretching endlessly beyond the wall, might harbor something far more alien and terrifying than the others who serve as its most visible representatives. Consider Bran Stark's green seer vision that took him into the heart of winter, an experience so traumatic that it left him terrified and unwilling to speak of what he had seen. This was not the fear of a boy who had glimpsed ice zombies or even the others themselves, but the profound existential terror that comes from encountering something that challenges the very foundations of reality as mortals understand it. The others, for all their alien nature and their association with death and winter, are still recognizably part of the natural order. They have intelligence, motivation, the ability to make bargains and form strategies. They create rather than simply destroy, fashioning armor from ice and raising the dead to serve their purposes. They represent winter, but winter as a season, a natural cycle that has its place in the larger pattern of the world. But what if the true source of the long night's horror lies not in the others themselves, but in what they serve? What if they are merely the servants or manifestations of something far more fundamental, a cosmic principle or entity that exists in complete opposition to the forces of life and fire that dragons represent? This entity would not be evil in any human sense, because evil implies motivation and choice. Instead, it would be something far more terrifying, a force of absolute negation that seeks not to rule or corrupt, but simply to reduce everything to perfect, unchanging stillness. It would be the cosmic equivalent of absolute zero, the theoretical point where all molecular motion stops and existence itself becomes impossible. Silverwing's refusal to cross the wall takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. The dragon was not simply detecting magical barriers or even the presence of dangerous enemies, but sensing the proximity of something that represented the complete antithesis of her own nature. Her distress was not fear of death, but recognition of something worse, the possibility of absolute cessation, the end not just of life, but of the very concept of change itself. Dragons, as creatures closely attuned to magical forces and cosmic principles, would be far more sensitive than humans to the presence of such a fundamental threat. Where a human might simply feel cold or unease, a dragon would experience the full existential terror of encountering a force that could not merely kill them, but undo the very concepts that made their existence possible. The wall's protective magic, in this interpretation, serves a dual purpose. The visible spells work to keep the others at bay, providing a barrier against their armies and their ice magic. But at a deeper level, the wall might contain more ancient and more powerful enchantments designed to contain or restrain this primordial force of negation, preventing it from expanding its influence into the lands where life and change are still possible. The construction of the wall itself, requiring the cooperation of giants, the children of the forest, and the early night CEO watch, suggests that its builders understood they were facing a threat that transcended normal political or military concerns. They were not just building a fortress, but creating a cosmic barrier, a boundary between the world where the normal rules of existence apply and a realm where those rules begin to break down entirely. This explains why dragons, despite their immense power and their historical role as the ultimate weapons of war, have never been successfully used against the others. It is not simply that fire and ice are opposed elements, but that dragons represent a fundamental principle of existence that cannot function in proximity to the absolute negation that the others serve. The closer a dragon gets to the true source of the long night's power, the more its own nature becomes impossible to sustain. The prophecy of the prince that was promised, destined to fight against the darkness with a flaming sword, takes on new significance in this context. This would not be a battle that could be won through conventional warfare or even through the deployment of dragons and armies. Instead, it would require someone capable of wielding fire, not just as a weapon but as a cosmic principle. someone who could stand against absolute negation and maintain the possibility of change and growth and life. The tragedy is that this cosmic horror may be stirring once more, growing stronger, as the natural cycles of the world bring another long night. The others' increased activity south of the wall might not represent their own initiative, but rather the inevitable consequence of serving a force that grows more active, as cosmic conditions align to favor absolute cold over life-giving warmth. Silverwing's refusal to cross the wall becomes, in this reading, one of the most important omens in Westerosi history. A warning that something worse than death awaits. In the north, something that even dragons, the mightiest creatures in the known world, recognize as utterly inimical to their existence. Her distress serves as a reminder that some threats cannot be faced with fire and blood, that some forms of darkness require forms of light that mortal minds can barely comprehend. The wall stands not just as humanity's shield against ice and death, but as the boundary between a world where dragons can fly and one where even the concept of flight becomes impossible. Beyond that barrier lies not just winter, but the end of winter itself. The final cold that makes even the cycle of seasons meaningless. The ultimate stillness that would render all of existence as motionless and lifeless as the heart of a dead star. Theory 15. The Meister. Conspiracy's true aim, eradicating prophecy, not just magic. The whispered rumors of a Meister conspiracy have circulated through the courts of Westeros for generations, carried in the warnings of men like Marwyn, the mage, and the bitter accusations of nobles like Lady Barbary Dustin. The common interpretation holds that the Citadel works systematically to eliminate magic from the world, that the Grey Rats view sorcery as a threat to rational thought and ordered society. But what if this understanding misses the deeper truth? What if the Meister's true enemy is not magic itself, but the far more dangerous force of prophecy, the belief that fate and destiny can shape the course of human events? Consider the fundamental difference between magic and prophecy in the world of Westeros. Magic, for all its wonders and terrors, operates according to discoverable principles. Dragons can be tamed through bloodline and training. Wildfire can be manufactured using precise alchemical processes. Even the more esoteric arts like shadow binding and blood magic follow consistent rules that can be studied, understood, and potentially replicated by anyone with sufficient knowledge and determination. Prophecy, however, represents something far more dangerous to the Meister's worldview. If the future can be known, if destiny truly shapes the course of events, then all human planning and rational decision-making becomes meaningless. The careful accumulation of knowledge, the patient study of cause and effect, the entire foundation of scholarly inquiry, all of it crumbles in the face of predetermined fate. More importantly, for the Meister's political position, prophecy threatens their role as advisors and counselors to the great houses of Westeros. If kings and lords believe that their fates are already written in the stars or revealed in dragon dreams, what need do they have for the careful counsel of learned men? Why listen to a Meister's analysis of political consequences when a woods witch or red priest claims to know the will of the gods? The history of Westeros is littered with catastrophes that began with someone taking a prophecy too seriously. The tragedy at Summerhall, where King Aegon V and much of the royal family died in flames while attempting to hatch dragon eggs, represents the ultimate example of prophetic thinking leading to disaster. Prince Rhaegar's obsession with the prince that was promised prophecy drove him to actions that ultimately triggered Robert's rebellion and brought down the Targaryen dynasty. From the Meister's perspective, these were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a fundamental flaw in human thinking. The tendency to seek meaning and purpose in random events, to find patterns where none exist, to surrender personal agency to the supposed demands of destiny. Every time a lord makes a decision based on a dream or a vision, instead of careful analysis of facts and consequences, the rational order that the Meisters represent loses ground to superstition and magical thinking. The elimination of dragons becomes more comprehensible when viewed through this lens. Dragons are not just magical creatures, but the primary vehicle through which prophecy manifests in the world. Dragon dreams, the mystical visions experienced by those with Targaryen blood, have shaped the course of Westerosi history more than any army or alliance. From Daenerys, the dreamer's vision that saved House Targaryen from the doom, to the various prophetic dreams that influenced Targaryen policy for centuries, dragons represent the intersection of magic and fate in ways that threaten everything the Masters believe about human agency and rational decision-making. Without dragons, the most powerful and influential prophecies become academic curiosities rather than actionable intelligence. The prince that was promised cannot return to save the world if there are no dragons for him to ride. The dragon must have 3 heads becomes meaningless poetry if no dragons exist to embody the metaphor. The Maester's campaign against dragons was not motivated by fear of magical creatures, but by recognition that these beasts serve as the primary conduit through which prophetic thinking influences political reality. The same logic applies to their attitude toward other forms of mystical knowledge. The Red Priests of Rahalor, with their flames that show visions of the future, represent exactly the kind of thinking that the Maesters view as dangerous. The woods witches and hedge wizards who claim to read the future in tea leaves and bird flights might seem harmless individually, but collectively, they reinforce the idea that ordinary people can access knowledge about fate and destiny without years of scholarly training. Even the faith of the Seven becomes a target when it strays too far into prophetic territory. The Maesters have no particular objection to religion that focuses on moral guidance and social order, but they become deeply uncomfortable when Septons begin speaking of divine visions and miraculous interventions. The rational order they seek to build requires that the gods, if they exist at all, operate through comprehensible natural laws rather than arbitrary supernatural interference. The Maester's infiltration of noble houses throughout Westeros gives them the perfect position to wage this subtle war against prophetic thinking. A well-placed Maester can discourage his lord from taking dreams too seriously, can provide rational explanations for apparently supernatural events, can gradually shift the focus of political discussion from mystical considerations to practical concerns. Over generations, this patient work can fundamentally alter how the nobility approaches decision-making, reducing their reliance on prophecy and increasing their dependence on scholarly advice. The beauty of this strategy lies in its subtlety and deniability. Unlike a direct assault on magical practitioners, the campaign against prophetic thinking can be conducted through education and persuasion rather than violence. Maesters don't need to hunt down and kill every woods witch and fortune teller. They simply need to convince enough people that such individuals are frauds and fools. That rational analysis provides better guidance than mystical revelation. The ultimate goal would be a Westeros, where political decisions are made based on careful study of precedent, analysis of economic conditions, and realistic assessment of military capabilities rather than on the supposed demands of destiny or the unclear pronouncements of oracles. The Maesters envision themselves as the guiding intelligence of this rational kingdom, providing the knowledge and analysis that lords need to govern effectively without recourse to supernatural guidance. The irony, of course, is that this campaign against prophecy might itself be driven by a kind of prophetic thinking, the Maesters' faith that reason and knowledge will ultimately triumph over superstition and magical belief. They have their own version of destiny, their own vision of how the world should develop, and they pursue it with the same single-minded determination that they criticize in others. The question that haunts this interpretation is whether the Maesters are ultimately right. In a world where magic demonstrably exists, where dragons have returned and ancient evils stir beyond the wall, is rational analysis really sufficient to guide human affairs? Or are there some truths that can only be perceived through dreams and visions, some threats that can only be countered by those who understand the deeper patterns that shape reality. The coming long night will likely provide the ultimate test of the Meister's philosophy. If the realm can be saved through careful planning and rational preparation, their victory over prophetic thinking will be vindicated. But if salvation requires someone to fulfill ancient prophecies and wield powers that transcend human understanding, then the Grey Rats may discover that their war against destiny has left humanity defenseless against forces that operate according to rules older and more fundamental than any written in their texts. Theory 16. The three heads of the dragon: past, present, and future kings. Prince Rhaegar. Targaryen's cryptic words about the dragon having three heads have echoed through the halls of power and the dreams of the ambitious for decades, generating countless theories about their meaning. Most interpretations focus on the immediate and practical. Three dragon riders for three dragons, three contemporary figures who will share Daenerys' power and purpose. But what if Rhaegar, with his deep understanding of prophecy and his scholarly nature, was thinking on a far grander scale? What if the three heads represent not three individuals living at the same time, but three pivotal monarchs across the entire sweep of Targaryen history, each embodying a different aspect of the dragon's role in the world? The first head would be Aegon the Conqueror, the foundational figure who established the Targaryen dynasty and forged the Seven Kingdoms into a single realm. Aegon represents the past, the raw power of conquest, the establishment of dragon rule, the moment when fire and blood first transformed the political landscape of Westeros. His reign marked the beginning of the Targaryen age, when dragons descended from the sky to remake the world according to Valyrian will. Aegon's significance goes beyond mere military conquest. He represented the principle of transformation through fire, the idea that existing orders could be swept away and replaced with something entirely new. The Field of Fire, where three dragons destroyed the combined might of the Reach and the Rock, demonstrated that traditional forms of power, armies, castles, ancient bloodlines, meant nothing in the face of dragon flame. Aegon didn't just conquer Westeros. He fundamentally redefined what power meant in that world. The second head would be Daenerys Targaryen, representing the present, the struggle for restoration, the return of dragons to a world that had forgotten their power, the resurrection of Targaryen rule in an age when magic itself was returning to the world. Daenerys embodies the principle of rebirth through fire, emerging from literal flames with living dragons to reclaim her family's lost heritage. But Daenerys represents more than just personal restoration. Her journey from powerless exile to the Mother of Dragons mirrors the broader awakening of magical forces throughout the world. Her dragon's birth coincides with the return of the others, the strengthening of magical abilities in individuals like Bran Stark, and the general resurgence of forces that had been dormant for generations. She is the dragon of the present moment, the bridge between the age when magic was ending and the new age when it returns in full force. The third head would be Jon Snow, representing the future. Not just the immediate future of the coming wars, but the ultimate destiny of the Targaryen bloodline and its role in the cosmic struggle between ice and fire. Jon embodies the principle of unity through fire, the joining of opposing forces, the reconciliation of ancient conflicts through the marriage of ice and fire in a single person. Jon's unique heritage makes him more than just another Targaryen claimant. As the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, he carries the blood of both dragons and wolves, fire and ice, the new gods and the old. His upbringing in the north, his connection to the old gods through the Weirwood network, his apparent ability to warg, all of this marks him as someone who can bridge the gap between the southern kingdoms where Targaryen power was traditionally based and the northern realms where older and perhaps more fundamental forces still hold sway. More importantly, Jon's position as both Targaryen and Stark, as both bastard and prince, as both Night's Watch brother and potential king, makes him uniquely suited to unite the disparate forces that will be needed to face the ultimate threat from beyond the wall. The prophecy of the prince that was promised speaks of someone born of the line of Aerys and Rhaella, but it also suggests that this figure will need to unite fire and ice, light and shadow, the living and the dead. The temporal progression of the three heads reflects the evolving nature of the challenges that the Targaryen bloodline has faced throughout its history. Aegon faced a political challenge, how to unite 7 kingdoms under a single crown. The solution was raw power, overwhelming force that left no room for resistance or negotiation. Daenerys faces a magical challenge, how to restore Targaryen rule in a world where the old certainties have broken down, where magic is returning but following new and unpredictable patterns. Her solution involves not just conquest but transformation, the literal rebirth of herself and her dragons from fire, the creation of new forms of power appropriate to a new age. Jon will face a cosmic challenge, how to preserve the very possibility of human civilization in the face of forces that seek to end not just individual lives, but the entire cycle of life and death, growth and decay that defines the natural world. His solution will require not just political unity or magical power, but a fundamental understanding of the balance between opposing forces, the ability to stand at the center of cosmic conflict and prevent either side from achieving total victory. This interpretation elevates Rhaegar's prophecy from a tactical concern about dragon riders to a grand statement about the destiny of House Targaryen across the centuries. The three heads are not just individuals, but archetypes, each representing a different stage in the evolution of dragon power and its relationship to the world. The dragon of the past established the principle that fire could reshape the world. The dragon of the present proved that fire could restore what had been lost. The dragon of the future will demonstrate that fire can preserve what matters most when everything else fails. Rhaegar's obsession with prophecy and his conviction that his son would be the prince that was promised take on new meaning in this context. He understood that Jon represented not just another generation of Targaryen rulers, but the culmination of centuries of preparation, the final expression of everything his bloodline had been building toward since Aegon first set foot on Westerosi soil. The tragedy is that Rhaegar himself could not live to see this culmination, that his actions in pursuing the prophecy led directly to the destruction of his family and the near extinction of his bloodline. But perhaps that was always part of the pattern. The dragon of the past had to die for the dragon of the present to be born, and the dragon of the present will have to sacrifice herself for the dragon of the future to fulfill his destiny. In the end, the three heads of the dragon represent not just 3 individuals, but 3 moments in time when the fate of the world hung in the balance, when Targaryen fire was the deciding factor between order and chaos, civilization and destruction, hope and despair. Aegon conquered a kingdom, Daenerys will reclaim it, and Jon will save it, not just from immediate threats, but from the ultimate darkness that would reduce all kingdoms, all dreams, all possibilities to ash and ice and silence. Theory 17. The lost matriarchs of the Whispering Sound, pre-Andal Fisher Queens. The fertile estuaries where the Manda meets the sea have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, each leaving their mark on the rich soil and ancient stones of what would become the Reach. The accepted histories speak of Garth Greenhand and the First Men, of the coming of the Andals and the rise of House Gardner. But what if these familiar narratives obscure an even older layer of human settlement? What if the coastal regions around Old Town, and the Whispering Sound were once ruled by a sophisticated maritime civilization that has been deliberately forgotten. A matriarchal society of fisher queens whose legacy was systematically erased by the patriarchal cultures that followed. The mystery begins with the very foundations of Old Town itself. The base of the High Tower, that massive structure that has dominated the entrance to the Whispering Sound for thousands of years, is built upon a fortress of fused black stone whose origins predate any known construction techniques in Westeros. The labyrinthine passages and chambers within this ancient foundation speak of builders who understood both stonework and hydraulics on a level that suggests deep familiarity with maritime engineering and coastal defense. Maester Yandel's speculation that House Hightower might descend not from the first men, but from an even older group of seafarers gains new significance when considered alongside other anomalies in the region's early history. The sophisticated harbor works at Old Town, the complex network of channels and islands that make up the Whispering Sound, the apparent antiquity of certain fishing villages that seem to have been established according to principles that don't match later settlement patterns. All of this points to a maritime culture that achieved considerable sophistication long before the traditionally recognized waves of migration and conquest. The concept of fisher queens is not unique to Westeros. Across the narrow sea, legends speak of similar figures who ruled floating kingdoms from elaborate vessels that served as both palaces and temples. These were not crude tribal leaders, but sophisticated rulers who understood that control of waterways and fishing grounds could provide the foundation for complex political structures. Their kingdoms moved with the seasons and the currents, following migration patterns of fish and favorable trading winds, creating networks of influence that spanned vast distances while remaining largely invisible to land-based powers. If such a civilization existed in the coastal waters of what is now the Reach, it would have operated according to fundamentally different principles than the territorial kingdoms that followed. Instead of fixed castles and rigid boundaries, the Fisher Queens would have ruled through a complex system of kinship networks, seasonal gatherings, and shared stewardship of marine resources. Their power would have been based not on the ability to hold land, but on knowledge of currents and tides, understanding of fish migration patterns, and mastery of the skills needed to harvest the sea's bounty. The matriarchal nature of this hypothetical civilization finds support in the practical realities of maritime life. In cultures where survival depends on successful fishing and sea trade, women often hold positions of considerable authority because of their roles in processing catches, managing household economies, and maintaining the complex social networks that enable communities to survive in challenging environments. The transition from matrilineal kinship systems to patriarchal inheritance represents a common pattern in human history, usually associated with the development of agriculture and the increasing importance of territorial control. The mysterious stone circles and ancient harbors scattered throughout the coastal regions of the Reach might represent remnants of Fisher Queen infrastructure, not temples or fortresses in the conventional sense, but astronomical observation posts and tide measurement stations that enabled these maritime rulers to predict seasonal changes and plan their movements accordingly. The knowledge required to create such installations would have been considerable, suggesting a level of scientific understanding that rivals anything achieved by later civilizations in Westeros. The systematic erasure of Fisher Queen culture would have been a gradual process, beginning with the arrival of the first men and accelerating under Andal influence. Land-based societies have strong incentives to control coastal resources and establish fixed settlements at strategic harbors. The mobile nature of Fisher Queen civilization would have made them vulnerable to territorial expansion by cultures that could build permanent fortifications and maintain standing armies. More insidiously, the patriarchal values of both First Men and Andal societies would have created powerful pressures to reinterpret or suppress any historical memories that depicted women as political leaders. The transition from Fisher Queen rule to male-dominated feudalism would have required not just military conquest, but ideological transformation, the systematic rewriting of history to make previous forms of governance seem primitive, unnatural, or simply impossible. The process of historical erasure would have been facilitated by the oral nature of Fisher Queen record-keeping. Maritime cultures often preserve their histories through songs, stories, and ritual performances rather than written texts, making their knowledge more vulnerable to deliberate suppression or gradual distortion. Each generation of conquerors could alter the stories slightly, emphasizing different aspects and de-emphasizing others, until the original Fisher Queen narratives became unrecognizable folktales about sea witches and mermaids. The role of the Citadel in this process deserves particular attention. The Meister's systematic compilation of historical knowledge would have required them to choose between competing versions of ancient events, and their own cultural biases would have led them to favor accounts that portrayed the development of civilization as a linear progression toward their own rational, male-dominated scholarly system. Fisher Queen histories, with their emphasis on cyclical time, seasonal governance, and female leadership, would have seemed not just foreign, but actively threatening to the intellectual framework the Meisters were trying to establish. Certain, persistent elements in Reach folklore might preserve echoes of Fisher Queen culture. The unusual prominence of female figures in local legends, the continued importance of fishing festivals and tide-related celebrations, the complex kinship patterns that persist in some coastal communities despite centuries of feudal influence. Even the sigil of House Hightower, with its beacon fire that guides ships safely to harbor, might represent a memory of Fisher Queen navigation techniques rather than a purely defensive military installation. The implications of this theory extend far beyond local history. If the coastal regions of Westeros were once ruled by sophisticated matriarchal maritime civilizations, it suggests that the continent's political development was far more complex and varied than the simplified narratives of conquest and replacement would suggest. Instead of a straightforward progression from primitive to advanced, from barbarism to civilization, the real history might involve the loss of valuable knowledge and alternative forms of social organization that could have contributed to a more balanced and sustainable relationship with the natural environment. The Fisher Queens, if they existed, represent a path not taken, a form of governance based on cooperation with natural cycles rather than domination over them, on flexible adaptation to changing conditions rather than rigid adherence to territorial boundaries. Their erasure from history reflects not just the victory of one culture over another, but the triumph of particular ways of thinking about power, gender, and humanity's relationship with the natural world. In the end, the mystery of the Fisher Queen serves as a reminder that history is written by the victors, and that the absence of evidence for alternative forms of civilization does not necessarily mean those alternatives never existed. The stones of Old Town's foundation keep their secrets, but they continue to support the tower above them, suggesting that even forgotten knowledge can provide the foundation for future achievements if we are wise enough to recognize its value and learn from its example. Theory 18, the seven-pointed star, an Andal appropriation of older sacred geometry. The seven-pointed star blazes forth from sept towers and holy books throughout Westeros, proclaimed by the faith as the sacred symbol, revealed by the gods themselves to the first Andal king. But what if this most recognizable emblem of the faith of the seven represents not a divine revelation, but a calculated appropriation? The Andal adoption and transformation of sacred geometry that was already ancient when Huger of the Hill first walked the hills of Andalos. What if the seven-pointed star was stolen from the very peoples the Andals sought to convert and conquer, its original meaning lost beneath layers of new doctrine and deliberate distortion? The traditional narrative presents the seven-pointed star as a unique gift from the divine, manifested when the father aspect of the godhead brought down 7 stars from the heavens to crown Huga of the Hill as the first Andal king. This founding myth establishes the symbol as distinctly Andal, a mark of divine favor that justified their subsequent conquests and conversions. But religious symbols rarely emerge from nothing. They typically evolve from earlier forms, adapting existing sacred imagery to serve new spiritual and political purposes. The number 7 itself predates Andal civilization by millennia. Archaeological evidence from across the known world suggests that sevenfold patterns held significance for many ancient cultures, appearing in everything from megalithic stone circles to astronomical observation posts. The apparent universality of 7 as a sacred number suggests that it taps into something fundamental about human psychology or cosmic structure. Patterns that would have been recognized and utilized by pre-Andal peoples in both Essos and Westeros. Consider the sophisticated astronomical knowledge required to create a 7-pointed star as a meaningful symbol. Such geometry implies understanding of celestial mechanics, mathematical relationships, and architectural principles that suggests considerable intellectual development. The precision required to construct 7-pointed star patterns in stone or metal indicates that the creators possessed both theoretical knowledge and practical skills of a high order. This level of sophistication seems unlikely to have emerged spontaneously with the Andals, pointing instead to inheritance from earlier traditions. The hills of Andalos, where the faith supposedly originated, were not empty wilderness when the Andals rose to prominence there. Like most regions of Essos, they had been inhabited for thousands of years by various peoples who left their own marks on the landscape. Stone circles, ancient roads, ruined fortresses, all of these testify to previous civilizations that developed their own religious and cultural traditions before being displaced or absorbed by later arrivals. If these earlier inhabitants of Andalos had developed sacred geometry based on 7-pointed star patterns, the rising Andal tribes would have encountered these symbols as they expanded their territory and influence. Rather than destroying or ignoring these existing sacred sites, shrewd Andal leaders might have recognized the practical value of incorporating familiar symbols into their new religious system. By adopting and reinterpreting existing sacred geometry, they could ease the process of conversion while claiming divine sanction for their expanding political authority. The process of religious syncretism, the blending of different belief systems, is one of the most common patterns in human religious history. Conquering cultures rarely attempt to eliminate existing spiritual practices entirely, as such efforts typically provoke fierce resistance and create lasting resentment. Instead, successful religious transformations usually involve the gradual reinterpretation of existing symbols and practices, allowing converts to maintain familiar forms while accepting new meanings. The 7 aspects of the Andal god, father, mother, warrior, maiden, smith, crone, and stranger, might themselves represent the Andal reinterpretation of an earlier 7-fold pantheon or spiritual system. Each point of the star could have originally corresponded to a distinct deity or cosmic principle, with the Andals gradually collapsing these separate entities into aspects of a single divine consciousness. This theological innovation would have allowed them to maintain the familiar 7-pointed symbolism while introducing the monotheistic concepts that distinguished their faith from earlier polytheistic traditions. The systematic destruction of weirwood groves and other sacred sites during the Andal invasion of Westeros takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. The Andals were not just eliminating competing religious symbols, but erasing evidence of the original contexts and meanings of the sacred geometry they had appropriated. By destroying the sites where 7-pointed star patterns might have originally been used, they could claim exclusive ownership of symbols that were actually much older and more widely distributed. The construction of septs on the sites of destroyed Godswoods represents more than simple conquest. It demonstrates the deliberate replacement of one sacred geometry with another. The seven-sided buildings of Andal worship, with their 7 altars and 7 pointed star windows, would have been immediately familiar to populations that had previously used 7 pointed star symbolism in their own religious practices. The transition from old faith to new could be presented as evolution rather than replacement, making conversion seem like natural development rather than foreign imposition. Archaeological evidence from various sept sites supports this interpretation. Beneath many of the oldest Andal religious buildings, excavations have revealed foundations and stone fragments that predate known Andal settlement. These earlier construction phases often feature mathematical proportions and astronomical alignments that suggest sophisticated understanding of sacred geometry, but their original symbolic meaning has been lost beneath centuries of Andal reinterpretation and renovation. The persistence of certain pagan elements within the faith of the Seven might represent incomplete erasure of the original 7-pointed star traditions. Local variations in sept architecture, regional differences in festival celebrations, the continued use of certain symbols and practices that don't quite fit Orthodox faith doctrine. All of these could be remnants of the pre-Andal sacred geometry, traditions that proved too deeply rooted to eliminate entirely. The political implications of this appropriation extend far beyond religious history. If the 7-pointed star was indeed stolen from earlier peoples rather than divinely revealed to the Andals, it calls into question the fundamental claims of legitimacy upon which Andal-derived political authority rests. The divine sanction, supposedly granted through the 7-pointed star, becomes a fraud, a manipulation of existing spiritual traditions for political gain. This interpretation also suggests that the true meaning of 7-pointed star sacred geometry might be preserved in traditions and practices that predate Andal influence. The mathematical relationships, astronomical alignments, and spiritual principles that originally gave the symbol its power could still exist in fragmentary form among peoples who maintained pre-Andal traditions despite centuries of pressure to convert. The irony is that by appropriating and distorting earlier 7-pointed star traditions, the Andals might have cut themselves off from the deeper wisdom that originally made the symbol sacred. Their politicized version of the 7-pointed star, tied to specific theological doctrines and institutional authority, lacks the flexibility and universality that made the original sacred geometry meaningful across multiple cultures and spiritual traditions. In the end, the question of the 7-pointed star's true origins becomes a metaphor for larger patterns of cultural appropriation and historical distortion. The victors write the histories, but they also rewrite the symbols, claiming for themselves the sacred geometry that preceded their arrival and erasing the contributions of those who came before. The 7-pointed star shines forth from every sept in Westeros, but its light might be borrowed rather than original. A stolen fire that has forgotten its own source, blazing with the accumulated wisdom of peoples whose names have been deliberately forgotten, but whose mathematical insights continue to inspire awe in all who contemplate the perfect symmetry of 7 points arranged around a center that cannot be moved. As we close this tome of speculation and shadow, we find ourselves standing at the edge of an abyss that grows deeper the longer we stare into it. The 18 theories we have woven together form not just a collection of alternative histories, but a map of the hidden currents that flow beneath the surface of everything we think we know about Westeros. Like the moving islands of the Neck, these ideas drift through the mists of time, sometimes visible, sometimes submerged, but always present for those who know how to look. What have we truly discovered in our journey through these labyrinthine possibilities? Perhaps the most profound revelation is that every accepted truth in Westerosi history conceals at least 3 alternative explanations, each more complex and disturbing than the last. The noble tale of Lyanna Stark's tragic death becomes a story of survival that could have shattered kingdoms. The natural disaster of Valyria's doom transforms into an inside job orchestrated by the very people it destroyed. The simple banditry of the Kingswood Brotherhood reveals itself as a proxy war between factions of the royal family itself. Each theory we have explored operates like a lever, and when pulled, it moves not just the immediate story, but the entire architecture of Westerosi civilization. Pull the lever of surviving Blackfire bloodlines, and suddenly the Golden Company's movements across 3 centuries make sense as part of a coordinated strategy rather than random opportunism. Pull the lever of Larys Strong's magical heritage, and the Dance of Dragons becomes not just a civil war, but a cosmic struggle between ancient forces wearing human faces. The pattern that emerges is one of systematic concealment, layer upon layer, of misdirection and false narrative designed to obscure truths that various power structures have deemed too dangerous for general knowledge. The Meisters suppress prophecy because prophecy threatens their monopoly on guidance. The Faith appropriates sacred geometry because original meaning threatens their claims to divine authority. The great houses bury inconvenient bloodlines because illegitimate children threaten carefully constructed succession narratives. But perhaps most unsettling is the realization that these conspiracies of silence often succeed in hiding the truth even from themselves. The descendants of Fisher Queens might walk through Old Town every day without knowing their heritage. The masters who burn books about dragons might genuinely believe they are protecting the realm from dangerous superstitions, unaware that they are eliminating humanity's only hope of surviving what is coming from beyond the wall. The lords who dismiss prophecy as nonsense might be cutting themselves off from the very warnings that could save their houses from destruction. This brings us to the central paradox of knowledge in the world we have explored. The more important a truth is, the more likely it is to be forgotten, distorted, or actively suppressed. The cosmic forces that terrify dragons into refusing to fly north are precisely the kinds of threats that rational minds prefer not to acknowledge. The possibility that the Night's King was attempting diplomacy rather than conquest is exactly the sort of nuanced historical interpretation that gets lost in favor of simpler moral narratives. The theories we have examined suggest that Westeros exists in a state of perpetual amnesia, each generation forgetting crucial lessons learned by their predecessors, each culture destroying the wisdom of those it conquers. The Andals burn the Weirwood groves and lose access to the old gods' knowledge. The Targaryens eliminate their dragons and sever their connection to prophetic dreams. The Meisters rationalize magic out of existence just as magic begins returning to the world in forms they cannot understand or control. Yet for all this deliberate and accidental forgetting, the truth has a way of preserving itself in unexpected forms. The red sap that weeps from heart trees carries the grief of the children of the forest across millennia. The cursed stones of Harrenhal remember the blood magic that was mixed into their mortar. The moving islands of the Neck continue to follow patterns established by ancient pacts between humans and beings that most of the world has forgotten even exist. This persistence of truth in disguised forms offers both hope and warning for those who would understand the world's deeper patterns. Hope, because it suggests that crucial knowledge can survive even determined attempts at suppression. Warning, because it means that ancient forces and forgotten commitments continue to shape current events in ways that contemporary political analysis cannot anticipate or account for. The magical renaissance that accompanies the return of dragons to the world takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. Daenerys' dragons are not just weapons or symbols of power, but keys that unlock doors that have been sealed for generations. Their return signals not just the restoration of Targaryen rule, but the awakening of magical forces that have been dormant since the last dragons died. The prophecies that seemed like empty poetry suddenly become urgent warnings. The ancient pacts that seemed like folklore reveal themselves as binding contracts that are about to come due. The cosmic scope of some of our theories, the suggestion that the true enemy beyond the wall represents a force of absolute negation that threatens the very concept of existence itself, places the familiar political struggles of Westeros in a perspective so vast that kingdoms and dynasties become merely local variations in a conflict that spans dimensions. If House Dane really does guard against cosmic horror, if the dragon horns were designed to control volcanic forces that could reshape continents, if the others serve something far more alien and terrible than winter itself, then the Game of Thrones becomes a sideshow to struggles that determine the fundamental nature of reality. This does not diminish the importance of human choices and human courage, but it does suggest that the heroes who will ultimately matter are those who can see beyond the immediate political landscape to understand the deeper forces at work. Jon Snow's unique heritage, combining ice and fire, north and south, old gods and new, positions him not just as a potential king, but as someone who might be able to bridge the gaps between different forms of knowledge and different ways of understanding the world. The tragic irony is that many of the conflicts that consume the realm's attention and resources, the wars between great houses, the struggles over succession, the debates about legitimacy and inheritance, might be distractions from the real threats that face human civilization. While lords fight over who gets to sit on a throne made of melted swords, cosmic forces gather strength for a confrontation that will make all earthly kingdoms irrelevant. Yet even this perspective might be incomplete, because our exploration has repeatedly shown that the cosmic and the personal, the magical and the political, the ancient and the immediate are all interconnected in ways that resist simple categorization. Larys Strong's clubfoot links him to forces that predate human civilization, but it also drives the very human choices that help tear apart the Targaryen dynasty. The weirwood trees embody the collective sorrow of an extinct species, but they also provide crucial intelligence to contemporary political players through their Green Seer network. Perhaps the ultimate lesson of our journey through these hidden truths is that understanding requires the willingness to hold multiple contradictory possibilities in mind simultaneously. Lyanna Stark might have died in childbirth, but she also might have survived to reshape the political landscape of Westeros. The doom of Valyria might have been a natural disaster, an inside job, or something far stranger that combines elements of both explanations. The Night's King might have been a tyrant, a failed diplomat, or a tragic figure whose true nature has been lost beneath centuries of propaganda and misunderstanding. This intellectual flexibility becomes not just an academic exercise, but a survival skill in a world where the most dangerous assumption is that any single explanation, no matter how compelling, captures the full complexity of historical truth. The characters who will navigate the coming storms most successfully will be those who can adapt their understanding as new information emerges, who can recognize when their most confident beliefs need to be abandoned in favor of explanations that seemed impossible until the evidence made them undeniable. The theories we have explored together serve as training exercises for this kind of mental agility. They stretch our imagination, challenge our assumptions, and prepare us for the possibility that the world is far stranger, far more dangerous, and far more wonderful than we ever dared to suspect. Whether any specific theory proves accurate matters less than whether our exploration has succeeded in expanding our capacity to recognize truth when it finally emerges from the shadows where it has been hiding. As the wheel of time turns toward whatever climax awaits, as the prophecies begin to fulfill themselves and the ancient forces awaken to play their long-delayed hands, those who have practiced looking beyond the surface of events will be better prepared to understand what they are witnessing. The Game of Thrones continues, but it is played on multiple levels simultaneously. with pieces that move according to rules written in languages that have been forgotten for millennia. In the end, these speculations serve as more than entertainment or intellectual exercise. They are preparation for a world where the impossible becomes inevitable, where the mythical reveals itself as historical, where the cosmic and the personal converge in ways that will test every assumption about what it means to be human in a universe that operates according to principles far grander and more terrifying than any throne room could contain. The shadows that these theories cast will continue to move across the landscape of imagination long after their specific details have been confirmed, refuted, or superseded by even stranger truths. They remind us that the most important stories are often those that have never been officially told, that the most crucial knowledge is frequently that which someone has tried very hard to suppress, and that the most profound mysteries are usually hiding in plain sight, waiting for minds bold enough to see past the comfortable lies to the uncomfortable truths that lie beneath. The game continues, but now we have glimpsed some of the rules that govern its deeper levels. Whether this knowledge proves to be wisdom or merely another form of beautiful ignorance, only time will tell. But in a world where dragons have returned and winter is coming, where ancient evils stir and prophecies awaken, perhaps the greatest danger of all would be to face the future with anything less than the fullest possible understanding of the forces that have shaped the past and continue to influence the present.